Hello, my dear sleepy listener. Welcome to Sleepy Crown, where history's quiet tales gently carry you into dreamland. Tonight, we embark on a peaceful journey through one of England's most dramatic yet bloodless revolutions, the story of James II, the Catholic king who lost everything without a single major battle. This is the tale of a monarch whose 3-year reign would reshape British history forever, a story of religious conflict, political intrigue, and the moment when Parliament finally claimed supremacy over the crown. We'll softly explore James's early years as the Duke of York, his controversial conversion to Catholicism, his brief but turbulent reign, and the remarkable revolution that would send him into permanent exile. Before you drift away into peaceful slumber, please take a moment to gently tap that like button. It truly helps our sleepy historical tales reach more dreamers like yourself. And if you're feeling chatty, don't be shy about leaving a comment below. I love hearing from our Sleepy Crown family, whether you're sharing your thoughts about James II, requesting future historical figures, or simply saying hello. Your comments always bring a smile to my face, and they help create our wonderful community of history lovers. If you're new here, consider subscribing to join our growing family of peaceful dreamers who find comfort in the gentle whispers of the past. We release new soothing historical documentaries regularly, each one crafted to carry you softly toward restful sleep. So settle in, close your eyes, and let the gentle currents of 17th century England wash over you as we explore how one king's unwavering faith would cost him 3 kingdoms, yet change the course of British history forever. James, later known as King James II of England and the 7th of Scotland, entered this world on a crisp October morning in 1633 at the Grand St James's Palace in London. The autumn air carried whispers of change, though none could have predicted how profoundly this second son would alter the destiny of the British monarchy. His father, Charles I, was already 11 years into his reign when James drew his first breath. The king stood as a figure of increasing controversy, his relationship with Parliament growing more strained with each passing season. Charles believed deeply in the divine right of kings, the notion that monarchs derived their authority directly from God, answerable to no earthly power. This belief would cast long shadows over young James's life, shaping his understanding of kingship and ultimately contributing to his downfall. James's mother, Queen Henrietta Maria, brought French Catholic blood into the English royal line. Sister to Louis XIII of France, she represented everything that made Protestant England nervous: Catholic ritual, foreign influence, and the spectre of papal authority creeping into their island kingdom. Her presence at court was a constant reminder of the religious tensions that simmered beneath the surface of Stuart rule. The infant James was not destined for the throne at birth. His older brother Charles, born 3 years earlier, held that honour as the Prince of Wales. James would receive the traditional title of the second son, Duke of York, a designation that would define much of his early life and eventually lend its name to one of the world's greatest cities. Growing up in the shadow of his destined-to-rule brother, James developed a personality quite different from the future Charles II. Where Charles would become known for his wit, charm, and ability to navigate complex political situations with grace, James grew into a more serious, straightforward character. He possessed an honesty that bordered on bluntness, a trait that would serve him poorly in the intricate world of royal politics. The royal nursery at St James's Palace bustled with activity during James's early years. Like all royal children of the era, he was raised not by his parents, but by an extensive household of tutors, governesses and servants. The Marquis of Hertford, William Seymour, took charge of James's education, a role he would maintain well into the boy's teenage years. James's childhood unfolded against the backdrop of his father's increasingly troubled reign. The young prince learned to read using primers that spoke of obedience to lawful authority, the sanctity of royal prerogative, and the natural order that placed kings above all earthly subjects. These lessons, absorbed in the peaceful chambers of the palace, would later clash violently with the political realities James would face as an adult. The court of Charles I maintained many Catholic practices, despite the official Protestantism of the realm. Henrietta Maria's household celebrated Mass openly, and the royal chapels echoed with Latin prayers and incense. Young James absorbed these influences, developing an early appreciation for Catholic ceremony that would profoundly shape his spiritual journey. As James grew from infant to boy, the political storm clouds gathering around his father darkened with each passing year. The king's attempts to rule without parliament, his introduction of new religious practices, and his queen's open Catholicism created a perfect storm of opposition. Little did anyone realise that these very conflicts would soon tear the royal family apart, sending young James into exile and shaping the man who would one day lose 3 kingdoms in a bloodless revolution. The peaceful days of James's early childhood were numbered. Soon enough, the growing boy would witness the collapse of everything he had been taught to revere: royal authority, divine right, and the natural order of English society. The education he received in those quiet palace chambers would prove utterly inadequate for the revolutionary world he was about to enter. But for now, in these gentle years before the storm, James remained simply the Duke of York, a serious-minded boy learning his letters, studying his catechism, and playing in the palace gardens, blissfully unaware that his destiny would be to become the last Catholic king of England, the monarch who would lose his throne without a battle, and the man whose reign would mark the final triumph of Parliament over Crown. The tranquil rhythm of royal life shattered like glass when James reached his 9th birthday. The year 1642 brought with it a constitutional crisis that would transform England forever, tearing apart the world of divine right monarchy that had shaped James's early understanding of power and authority. Parliament, that body his father had so often dismissed or ignored, finally reached its breaking point. Years of grievances, financial, religious, and constitutional, erupted into open rebellion against King Charles I. The ancient harmony between Crown and Parliament, already strained to its limits, snapped entirely when the king attempted to arrest 5 members of the House of Commons for treason. James watched, perhaps with a child's incomplete understanding, as his father prepared for war against his own subjects. The concept must have been bewildering to a boy raised to believe in the absolute authority of kingship. How could subjects rightfully take up arms against their divinely appointed sovereign? Yet that was precisely what was happening across England. The royal family found itself forced to abandon London, that great city where James had spent his comfortable early years. The journey north to York represented more than a simple relocation. It marked the beginning of James's education in the harsh realities of contested power. No longer could royal authority be taken for granted. It had to be fought for, defended, and justified. In York, James witnessed his first taste of his father's attempts to rally support. The ancient city, with its magnificent minster and loyal gentry, seemed to offer a bulwark against parliamentary opposition. Here, Charles I hoped to gather forces sufficient to restore his authority throughout the realm. Young James accompanied his father to various ceremonial occasions, his presence serving as a symbol of dynastic continuity and legitimacy. The formalities of medieval kingship continued even as England slid towards civil war. James was invested with the Order of the Garter, that ancient symbol of English chivalry, in a ceremony that maintained royal traditions even as the kingdom fractured around them. The young duke learned the rituals and pageantry of monarchy, even as their political foundation crumbled. When diplomacy failed and positions hardened beyond reconciliation, Charles I raised his standard at Nottingham, formally declaring war against Parliament. James, now old enough to understand the gravity of the situation, found himself thrust into a conflict that would define the rest of his life. The comfortable certainties of his early childhood gave way to the brutal education of civil war. The first major battle came at Edgehill in October 1642, and both royal princes were present on the field. James experienced his first taste of warfare at the tender age of 9, watching as Cavalier cavalry charged parliamentary infantry, while cannon smoke drifted across the autumn countryside. The battle ended indecisively, but it marked James's baptism in the violent world of 17th century politics. Following the battle, the royal court established itself at Oxford, the ancient university city that would serve as the royalist capital for much of the Civil War. Here, James received education quite different from what had been planned in the peaceful nurseries of St James's Palace. Instead of classical texts and religious instruction, he learned the harsh lessons of siege warfare, political loyalty, and the fragility of royal power. Oxford during the Civil War years was a peculiar place, a city trying to maintain scholarly traditions while serving as a military headquarters. James studied under new tutors, including Brian Dupper, the displaced Bishop of Salisbury, who attempted to continue the prince's formal education amidst the chaos of war. The young Duke learned Latin and French, mathematics and theology, but his most important education came from observing the daily reality of a monarchy under siege. The transformation in James's circumstances was complete. From a pampered prince in a stable kingdom, he had become a refugee in his own country, dependent on the loyalty of subjects who increasingly questioned the very foundations of royal authority. The comfortable assumptions about divine right and natural hierarchy that had shaped his early years now seemed fragile and contested. As the Civil War raged on, James began to develop the characteristics that would define his later reign: a stubborn adherence to principle even when politically costly, a deep suspicion of those who challenged royal prerogative, and an unwavering belief in the rightness of his cause regardless of popular opinion. These traits, forged in the crucible of civil war, would ultimately prove both his strength and his downfall. The boy who had entered the world as a secure second son was being transformed into something quite different, a prince who understood that royal authority was not a given, but something that had to be fought for, defended, and sometimes lost. This hard-won knowledge would shape every decision James made as an adult, from his conversion to Catholicism to his stubborn resistance to parliamentary limitations on royal power. By 1646, the tide of civil war had turned decisively against King Charles I. The new model army, Parliament's professional fighting force, had proven superior to the royalist forces in battle after battle. Oxford, that final stronghold of royal authority, found itself surrounded and under siege. For 13-year-old James, the approaching defeat meant the end of everything he had known. The surrender of Oxford in June 1646 marked the collapse of the royalist cause. James watched as his father's supporters melted away, some fleeing abroad, others seeking accommodation with the victorious Parliament. The young Duke found himself facing a future he could never have imagined, life as a prisoner in his own kingdom. Parliament's victory brought with it a crucial decision about the royal children. While King Charles I was taken into custody to face an uncertain fate, his younger children presented a different problem. James, along with his sister Elizabeth and baby brother Henry, were considered too young to pose an immediate political threat, yet too valuable as symbols to be ignored. The parliamentary commissioners who took charge of the royal children were not unkind, but they were firm in their authority. James was removed from Oxford and taken to London, where he was housed at St James's Palace, the very building where he had been born 13 years earlier. The irony was stark. The prince had returned home, but as a prisoner rather than an heir to the throne. Life under parliamentary supervision was a strange existence for James. He was treated with the courtesy due to his birth, yet constantly reminded of his changed circumstances. His movements were restricted, his companions chosen by his captors, and his education directed toward creating a more politically acceptable prince. The Parliament hoped to mould James into a ruler who would accept constitutional limitations on royal power. They appointed tutors who emphasised the contractual nature of government, the rights of subjects, and the importance of religious orthodoxy within the established Church of England. These lessons fell on largely deaf ears. James had already formed his fundamental beliefs about the nature of kingship during the Civil War years. During his captivity, James began to display the intellectual limitations that would handicap him throughout his life. Unlike his brilliant older brother Charles, who possessed a quick wit and natural political instincts, James was a plodding student who struggled with abstract concepts. His tutors found him dutiful but unimaginative, capable of memorizing lessons but unable to adapt principles to changing circumstances. The young Duke's religious education during this period proved particularly significant. Parliament was determined to ensure that he remained firmly within the Protestant fold, assigning Anglican chaplains to oversee his spiritual development. Yet James found himself increasingly drawn to the Catholic practices he had observed in his mother's household. The seeds of his later conversion were already present in the questioning mind of the teenage prince. As months passed in captivity, James began to understand that his position was far from secure. Parliament engaged in serious discussions about the royal succession, with some members suggesting that the young Duke might make a more suitable king than his father or older brother. The prospect of becoming a puppet, ruler under parliamentary control, held no appeal for James, who had absorbed his father's beliefs about divine right monarchy. The parliamentary commissioners overseeing James's captivity reported regularly on his behaviour and attitudes. They noted his serious demeanour, his dedication to his studies, and his apparent acceptance of his circumstances. What they failed to detect was the growing determination in the young prince to escape their control and join his family in whatever fate awaited them. James's captivity also exposed him to a wider range of English society than he had encountered during his sheltered early years. The servants, guards, and officials who supervised his daily life came from backgrounds far different from the courtiers who had surrounded him previously. This experience gave him insights into the concerns and grievances of ordinary English people, though he would prove unable to act on this knowledge effectively when he later became king. The psychological impact of these years of captivity cannot be underestimated. James learned to distrust those who claimed to act in his best interests while limiting his freedom. He developed a deep suspicion of parliamentary government and constitutional monarchy that would influence every decision he made as an adult. The experience of being a prisoner in his own kingdom convinced him that any limitation on royal power was fundamentally illegitimate. As 1647 gave way to 1648, James began to sense that his opportunity for escape was approaching. His father's situation was deteriorating rapidly, and it seemed likely that the royal family would face even harsher treatment in the months ahead. The teenage Duke began to plan his escape, knowing that his future, and perhaps his life, depended on reaching safety abroad. The boy who had been captured as a symbol of defeated royalty was preparing to emerge as a prince determined to restore the authority that Parliament had tried to destroy. His years of captivity had not created the constitutional monarch that Parliament hoped for, but rather had forged a future king more determined than ever to rule as his ancestors had, by divine right, answerable to God alone, and bound by no earthly limitations on royal prerogative. The spring of 1648 brought with it a new phase of civil war, as royalist forces attempted once more to restore King Charles I to his throne. For James, now 14 years old and increasingly restless under parliamentary supervision, the renewed conflict presented an opportunity that might not come again. The young Duke had been carefully observing the routines of his captors, noting the changing of guards, the patterns of daily life at St. James's Palace, and the security measures that kept him prisoner. Unlike his father, who often seemed paralysed by the complexity of his situation, James possessed a straightforward approach to problems that served him well in planning his escape. The plot to free James required careful coordination between loyalists within the palace and royalist agents operating in London. The scheme was audacious in its simplicity. During one of his regular walks in the palace gardens, James would slip away from his guards and meet Confederates who would spirit him out of the country. Colonel Joseph Bampfield, a royalist officer who had fought in the Civil War, took charge of the escape arrangements. Bampfield understood the stakes involved. If James could reach safety abroad, he would represent hope for the future restoration of the monarchy. Failure would likely result in much stricter confinement for the young Duke and possible execution for those who aided him. The escape plan required James to demonstrate acting skills he had never needed before. He had to maintain his normal routine, showing no sign of the excitement or nervousness he must have felt. His guards, who had grown accustomed to his obedient behaviour over the months of captivity, suspected nothing as the day of the escape approached. On the appointed evening in April 1648, James made his move. During what appeared to be an ordinary walk in the palace gardens, he simply vanished. The guards, realising too late what had happened, raised the alarm throughout London. But by then, the young Duke was already well on his way to freedom. The journey from London to the coast required careful planning and considerable courage. James, disguised as an ordinary gentleman, travelled through a countryside torn by civil war. Parliamentary forces controlled most major routes, and roadblocks were common. Discovery would mean not only the failure of the escape, but severe punishment for all involved. Bampfylde had arranged for James to reach the coast at Dover, where a ship waited to carry him across the Channel to safety in the Netherlands. The Dutch Republic, though officially neutral in England's civil war, had strong Protestant ties that made it a natural refuge for English exiles of all political persuasions. The crossing of the English Channel marked a profound transition in James's life. As the English coastline faded behind him, the teenage prince was leaving behind not only his homeland but his childhood. The boy who had grown up expecting to live as a duke in a stable monarchy was about to begin life as an exile in an uncertain world. The Netherlands of 1648 was a remarkable place, a republic that had won its independence from Catholic Spain through decades of warfare, creating a society based on trade, religious tolerance, and republican government. For James, raised to believe in divine right monarchy, the Dutch system represented everything his family opposed, yet it offered the safety he desperately needed. The Hague, seat of the Dutch government, had become a gathering place for English exiles of various political persuasions. James found himself in the company of other refugees from the Civil War, nobles who had lost their estates, clergymen who had been ejected from their livings, and soldiers who had fought for the king. This community of exiles would provide James with his primary social circle for the next several years. The successful escape from England demonstrated qualities in James that would characterise his entire life: personal courage, determination to achieve his goals regardless of obstacles, and a willingness to take significant risks for his principles. These same qualities would later contribute to his downfall as king, but in 1648 they represented the difference between captivity and freedom. News of James's escape created considerable embarrassment for the parliamentary government. The fact that a 14-year-old boy had simply walked away from his guards highlighted the limitations of their security arrangements and suggested that popular support for the royal family remained stronger than they had assumed. The escape also marked the beginning of James's education in continental European politics and military affairs. Unlike England, where civil war had disrupted traditional military structures, the continent offered professional armies and experienced commanders who could teach the young duke the arts of war. This military education would prove invaluable during James's later career as a soldier and admiral. Most importantly, the escape reunited James with his family and restored his sense of identity as a member of the royal house. No longer was he an isolated prisoner dependent on the goodwill of his captors. He was once again a prince of the blood, free to pursue his destiny and work toward the restoration of the monarchy. The boy who had slipped away from his guards in the palace gardens had taken the first step toward becoming the man who would one day rule 3 kingdoms and lose them all in a bloodless revolution. The Dutch Republic of the late 1640s offered James his first taste of life beyond the confines of Stuart England. The Hague, with its tree-lined canals and prosperous merchant houses, presented a stark contrast to the war-torn England he had left behind. Here, in this bastion of Protestant republicanism, the young Catholic-leaning prince would spend his formative teenage years. The exiled English court at The Hague was a curious institution, a government without a country, maintaining the forms and ceremonies of monarchy, while depending entirely on foreign hospitality. James found himself part of a community that included displaced nobles, loyal clergymen, and professional soldiers, all united by their devotion to the Stuart cause and their determination to restore royal authority in England. Life in exile taught James lessons he never would have learned in the comfortable isolation of English royal palaces. He discovered that royal authority meant nothing without the practical power to enforce it, that loyalty was often conditional on circumstances, and that even the most devoted subjects had their own interests to consider. These were harsh lessons for a young man raised to believe in the absolute nature of royal prerogative. The Dutch provided the exiled Stuarts with courtesy and protection, but they made clear that this hospitality came with expectations. The Netherlands was engaged in its own struggle for survival against Catholic Spain, and Dutch leaders hoped that a restored Stuart monarchy might prove a valuable ally against their Catholic enemies. This placed James in the awkward position of being simultaneously grateful for Dutch protection and uncomfortable with their republican values. The young Duke's education during these exile years was unlike anything he might have received in England. Instead of the classical curriculum traditionally provided to royal princes, James learned the practical arts of diplomacy, military science, and international relations. His tutors included not only displaced English scholars, but also continental experts who understood the complex balance of power that governed European politics. Language study became particularly important during this period. James had always been proficient in French, the language of his mother's household, but exile forced him to become truly fluent. He also learned Dutch and improved his Latin, skills that would serve him well in his later diplomatic and military career. The polyglot nature of the exile community meant that linguistic ability was essential for effective communication. The religious atmosphere of the Netherlands profoundly influenced James's spiritual development. While the Dutch Republic was officially Calvinist, it practiced a degree of religious tolerance unknown in most of Europe. Catholics, Lutherans, and various Protestant sects worshipped alongside the established Reformed Church. This exposure to religious diversity began to shape James's later policies regarding toleration, though he would apply these lessons selectively and controversially. Military affairs occupied much of James's attention during his Dutch exile. The ongoing war between Spain and the Netherlands provided constant opportunities to observe modern warfare in action. James studied fortification, artillery, and cavalry tactics under experienced Dutch officers who had spent their careers fighting the Spanish armies. This military education would prove invaluable when he later commanded English naval and land forces. The social life of the exile community was both intimate and cosmopolitan. James found himself interacting with displaced English nobles, Dutch merchants, German princes, and French diplomats, all of whom brought different perspectives on politics, religion, and culture. This exposure to diverse viewpoints broadened his understanding of European affairs, though it may have also contributed to his later inflexibility by showing him how isolated English concerns were from continental realities. Personal relationships formed during the Dutch exile would influence James throughout his life. He developed close friendships with fellow exiles, who shared his experiences of displacement and loss, bonds that would prove crucial when these men later served in his administration. He also learned to navigate the complex etiquette of court life in exile, where precedents and protocol remained important despite the community's dependence on foreign charity. The psychological impact of exile shaped James's character in ways that would become apparent only decades later. The experience of losing everything, home, status, security, and then slowly rebuilding created in him a deep appreciation for loyalty and an equally deep suspicion of those who challenged established authority. These attitudes would prove politically disastrous when he later became king of a country that had itself experienced revolutionary change. As the months of exile stretched into years, James began to understand that restoration of the Stuart monarchy was far from certain. His father remained a prisoner in England, facing an increasingly hostile parliament that showed little inclination toward compromise. the young Duke realised that he might spend his entire life in exile, a sobering thought that forced him to consider what kind of man he wanted to become if he could never claim his birthright. The Dutch years provided James with a cosmopolitan education that few English princes had ever received. He learned to see England as one country among many, the Stuart dynasty as one royal house among several, and religious conflict as a European-wide phenomenon rather than a purely English concern. This broader perspective would influence his later policies as king, though not always in ways that served his political interests. Most significantly, the experience of exile taught James that political power was fragile and conditional. He had seen his father's authority collapse, witnessed the dissolution of institutions that had seemed permanent, and learned that even divine right monarchy could be challenged successfully. These lessons would make him both more flexible and more paranoid when he eventually gained power himself, contributing to the contradictions that would ultimately destroy his reign. The winter of 1649 brought news that shattered the exiled royal family and forever changed James's understanding of the world. On January 30th, his father, King Charles I, was publicly executed in London, becoming the first English monarch to die on the scaffold. For 16-year-old James, the event represented not just the loss of a father, but the destruction of everything he had been taught to believe about the nature of kingship and divine authority. The trial and execution of Charles I marked an unprecedented moment in European history. Never before had a reigning monarch been formally tried and executed by his own subjects. The act sent shockwaves throughout the courts of Europe and fundamentally altered the relationship between rulers and ruled across the continent. For James, witnessing these events from exile, the execution represented both a personal tragedy and a political catastrophe. News of the king's death reached The Hague through a network of messengers and diplomatic channels that had been carrying increasingly grim reports from England throughout the winter. The exiled court had hoped against hope that some compromise might be reached, that Charles I might accept limitations on his authority in exchange for his life. The finality of execution made clear that no such accommodation was possible. The immediate aftermath of the king's death created a crisis of leadership within the exiled community. James's older brother Charles was immediately proclaimed King Charles II by the loyal remnant, but this was a hollow title without practical meaning. The new king possessed no army, no treasury, and no territory beyond the goodwill of foreign hosts. The Stuart cause seemed hopeless. For James personally, his father's execution marked the end of childhood and the beginning of adult responsibilities. At 16, he was no longer simply the Duke of York, but a prince of a deposed dynasty, with obligations to restore his family's honour and authority. The comfortable assumption that he would one day inherit his traditional role gave way to the grim realisation that everything would have to be fought for and won. The psychological impact of the execution on James cannot be overstated. His father had represented not just royal authority but divine order itself. Charles I's death suggested that this order could be overthrown by mere mortals, that kings were not protected by God, and that traditional hierarchy was more fragile than anyone had imagined. These revelations would haunt James for the rest of his life. The execution also intensified James's developing religious convictions. His father had died, in the eyes of loyal subjects, as a martyr for the cause of legitimate monarchy and traditional Christianity. The Puritan Parliament that had ordered the execution represented everything that James was learning to despise: religious fanaticism, political radicalism, and contempt for established authority. These associations would profoundly influence his later conversion to Catholicism. European reaction to the king's execution was uniformly hostile. Catholic and Protestant monarchs alike recognised the dangerous precedent that had been set. If the English could execute their king, what prevented other subjects from following the same path? The execution made the Stuart exiles figures of international sympathy, while isolating the new English Commonwealth from most of European society. The practical consequences of the execution for the exile community were severe. Foreign governments that had provided modest support in the hope of an eventual restoration now questioned whether the Stuart cause was worth supporting. The execution suggested that English republicanism was more deeply rooted than previously assumed, making foreign intervention both more risky and less likely to succeed. James watched as his brother Charles II struggled to maintain the loyalty of their supporters in the face of this disaster. Some exiles began to seek accommodation with the Commonwealth government, calculating that restoration was impossible and that their futures lay in making peace with the new regime. Others doubled down on their commitment to restoration, viewing their father's execution as a crime that could only be avenged through the complete destruction of the parliamentary government. The execution also clarified for James the religious dimensions of the conflict that had torn England apart. His father had died defending what he saw as the true church against Puritan extremism. The Parliament that had ordered the execution represented radical Protestantism taken to its logical extreme. These associations began to push James toward the Catholic Church, which offered both a refuge from Protestant extremism and a connection to the international opposition to English republicanism. In the months following the execution, James began to develop the uncompromising approach to political opposition that would characterize his later reign. His father's willingness to die rather than accept limitations on royal authority became, in James's mind, the gold standard for royal behaviour. Any compromise with constitutional limitations represented betrayal of his father's memory and abandonment of divine right monarchy. The execution of Charles I transformed James from a displaced prince, hoping for restoration, into a revolutionary, determined to destroy the regime that had murdered his father. This transformation would influence every decision he made for the rest of his life, from his choice of allies to his religious conversion to his stubborn resistance to parliamentary authority when he finally gained the throne. The boy who had escaped from England as a prisoner had become a young man committed to revenge, restoration, and the complete vindication of everything his father had died defending. The seeds of his later downfall were planted in the grief and rage he felt, watching his father's head fall beneath the executioner's axe on that cold January morning in 1649. The years following his father's execution transformed James from a displaced prince into a professional soldier. With restoration seeming increasingly unlikely, the young duke needed to create a new identity for himself, one that would provide both purpose and practical skills. The armies of continental Europe offered opportunities for advancement that the exile community at The Hague could not provide. France, despite its complex relationship with the English exiles, provided James with his first opportunity for serious military service. The young duke joined the French army as a volunteer, serving under the renowned Marshal Turenne in campaigns against both internal rebels and foreign enemies. This military apprenticeship would prove invaluable in shaping James's understanding of warfare and command. The French military system of the mid-17th century was the most advanced in Europe. James learned modern tactics, siege warfare, and the complex logistics required to maintain armies in the field. More importantly, he learned leadership under fire, discovering that he possessed both personal courage and the ability to inspire confidence in subordinates. These qualities would serve him well in his later career as Lord High Admiral of the English Navy. Service in the French army also exposed James to Catholic military culture. Many of his fellow officers were devout Catholics, who saw military service as compatible with, even supportive of, their religious faith. This stood in stark contrast to the Puritan military tradition that had emerged in England, where soldiers were expected to be moral reformers as well as fighters. The Catholic approach to military service appealed to James's developing religious sensibilities. The campaign against the Fronde, the series of civil wars that convulsed France in the early 1650s, provided James with his first taste of serious combat. Fighting alongside French regulars against rebel nobles and their armies, he learned that warfare was far more complex and brutal than the romantic literature of chivalry suggested. The experience hardened him physically and emotionally, preparing him for the challenges he would face as an adult ruler. James's service record in the French army was distinguished by both courage and competence. Marshal Turenne, one of the great military commanders of the age, praised the young Duke's performance in battle and recommended him for promotion. By 1654, James had been appointed Lieutenant General, a remarkable achievement for a 21-year-old exile with no resources beyond his own abilities. The promotion to Lieutenant General marked James's emergence as a military commander in his own right. He was given command of an Irish regiment composed largely of Catholic soldiers who had fled Ireland after the Cromwellian conquest. Leading these men, who shared his hostility to English Puritanism, reinforced James's identification with Catholic military culture and his opposition to the Protestant extremism that had executed his father. However, James's military career in French service was cut short by the diplomatic revolution of 1657, when France allied itself with Cromwell's England against Spain. This alliance made the presence of Stuart exiles in the French army diplomatically embarrassing, and James found himself expelled from French service despite his excellent record. The experience taught him that even military competence could not overcome political realities. Forced to leave France, James made the difficult decision to join the Spanish army fighting in the Netherlands. This meant taking up arms against his former French comrades, a morally complex situation that highlighted the precarious position of political exiles. James justified his decision by arguing that any enemy of the English Commonwealth was a potential ally of the Stuart cause, regardless of their religion or nationality. Spanish military service provided James with a different perspective on European warfare. The Spanish army, though past its prime, maintained traditions dating back to the great conquests of the 16th century. James learned from veterans who had fought in Germany, Italy, and the Americas, gaining insights into global strategy and imperial administration that would influence his later policies as king. The Battle of the Dunes in 1658 saw James fighting against an Anglo-French army that included many English soldiers serving Cromwell's Republic. The irony of Englishmen fighting Englishmen on foreign soil was not lost on the young Duke, who saw the battle as symbolic of the divisions that had torn his homeland apart. Though the Spanish army was defeated, James's personal performance was again praised by his superiors. Military service taught James valuable lessons about leadership, logistics, and international relations, but it also reinforced some of his most problematic character traits. The military emphasis on hierarchy and unquestioning obedience appealed to his authoritarian instincts, while the international nature of his service convinced him that English concerns were less important than European-wide religious and political conflicts. The years as a soldier of fortune also developed James's appreciation for professional military men and his distrust of civilian interference in military affairs. When he later became king, he would consistently favour military advisers over civilian politicians, a preference that would contribute to his political difficulties. His military experience taught him that decisive action was preferable to lengthy deliberation, an approach that worked well on the battlefield but poorly in the complex world of parliamentary politics. Most significantly, James's military service convinced him that personal honour and religious conviction were more important than political expediency. He had served faithfully under both French and Spanish command, not because he supported their political objectives, but because military service offered a way to maintain his dignity and prepare for future opportunities. This willingness to sacrifice immediate political advantage for personal principle would define his later reign and ultimately cost him his throne. The professional soldier who emerged from these years of continental warfare was a very different man from the boy who had escaped from England in 1648. James had learned to command men, to face death with courage, and to maintain his principles under pressure. Unfortunately, he had also learned to see political opposition as tantamount to military rebellion, a perspective that would prove disastrous when applied to the subtleties of English parliamentary politics. The year 1660 brought changes that seemed to defy all reasonable expectations. After 11 years of Republican government under Oliver Cromwell and his son Richard, England experienced a sudden and dramatic transformation that restored the Stuart monarchy without bloodshed. For James, Now 26 years old and hardened by a decade of military service, the Restoration represented not just a return home but vindication of everything his family had suffered to preserve. The collapse of the Cromwellian Protectorate began with the death of Oliver Cromwell in September 1658. The great military leader who had dominated English politics for over a decade left behind a son who possessed neither his father's military genius nor his political acumen. Richard Cromwell, mockingly called Tumbledown Dick by his enemies, found himself unable to control either the army or Parliament. News of England's political instability reached the exile community through a network of correspondents who had maintained contact despite the dangers involved. James watched with growing excitement as reports arrived describing the breakdown of Republican government, the quarrels between different military factions, and the growing popular desire for a return to traditional monarchy. The Restoration process began not with foreign invasion or royalist rebellion, but with a remarkable transformation in English public opinion. General George Monk, commanding English forces in Scotland, marched south to London with the declared intention of restoring legitimate parliamentary government. His actions set in motion a chain of events that would culminate in the recall of the Stuart dynasty. James's brother Charles had spent the years of exile developing the political skills that had always eluded their father. Unlike Charles I, who had seen compromise as weakness, Charles II understood that restoration would require concessions to the forces that had overthrown royal government. The Declaration of Breda, issued in April 1660, promised amnesty for past enemies, religious toleration, and respect for parliamentary rights. The Convention Parliament that assembled in April 1660 faced the remarkable task of undoing 11 years of Republican government. The members, many of whom had served under the Commonwealth, now found themselves welcoming back the dynasty they had helped to overthrow. The speed of this transformation amazed contemporary observers and highlighted the shallow roots of English republicanism. For James, the Restoration represented both triumph and challenge. He was returning to an England he barely remembered, having left as a teenage exile and returning as an experienced military commander. The country had changed profoundly during his absence, developing new political traditions, religious practices, and social attitudes that would complicate his readjustment to English life. The royal brothers landed at Dover on May 25, 1660, to scenes of wild celebration. Church bells rang across the kingdom, bonfires blazed on hilltops, and crowds gathered to welcome the returning monarchy. For James, who had spent 12 years as a landless exile dependent on foreign charity, the enthusiastic reception must have seemed almost miraculous. The restoration of the monarchy brought with it the restoration of James's titles and position at court. He resumed his role as Duke of York and was granted the office of Lord High Admiral, a position that would define much of his subsequent career. More importantly, he was once again heir presumptive to the throne, since his brother Charles remained unmarried and childless. The early years of the Restoration period were marked by a deliberate attempt to restore traditional English institutions and customs. The Church of England was re-established, the House of Lords reconvened, and the ancient ceremonies of monarchy were revived. James participated enthusiastically in this restoration of tradition, seeing it as vindication of everything his family had fought to preserve. However, the Restoration also revealed the extent to which England had changed during the years of Republican government. New religious groups had emerged, parliamentary traditions had developed, and political attitudes had evolved in ways that would complicate royal government. James, with his continental military experience and authoritarian instincts, was poorly prepared to navigate these changes. The social atmosphere of Restoration England was markedly different from the Puritan austerity that had characterised the Commonwealth period. Theatres reopened, music and dancing flourished, and court life resumed its traditional splendour. James, who had spent his adult years in the relatively austere environment of military camps, found himself adjusting to a culture of pleasure and entertainment that was both attractive and morally troubling. The restoration of the monarchy also brought with it the restoration of old problems that had contributed to the original conflict between Charles I and Parliament. Questions of religious policy, constitutional authority, and fiscal responsibility remained unresolved. The enthusiasm that greeted the royal return could not disguise the fact that the fundamental issues that had caused the Civil War had not been definitively settled. For James personally, the Restoration marked the beginning of a new phase of life, in which he would need to balance his role as a royal prince with his growing religious convictions and his continental perspective on politics. The young man who returned to England in 1660 was no longer the boy who had escaped in 1648, and the England he found was not the country he had left behind. The Restoration miracle that brought the Stuarts back to the throne also established the conditions that would eventually lead to James's downfall. The religious tensions, constitutional questions, and political divisions that had caused the original revolution remained latent within English society, waiting for the right circumstances to re-emerge. James would provide those circumstances when he attempted to restore Catholic influence in a country that had become decisively Protestant. The Restoration court of Charles II was notorious throughout Europe for its licentiousness and moral flexibility. Into this environment came James, Duke of York, a serious-minded military veteran whose romantic entanglements would create the first major scandal of the new reign and establish patterns of behaviour that would influence the rest of his life. Within months of his return to England, James found himself embroiled in a situation that shocked even the tolerant society of Restoration Court. He had begun a passionate affair with Anne Hyde, daughter of Edward Hyde, Earl of Clarendon and the King's chief minister. What made this relationship particularly scandalous was not just Anne's relatively modest social background, but the fact that she was already pregnant with James's child. Anne Hyde was an intelligent and strong-willed woman who had served as maid of honour to James's sister Mary in the Netherlands. Unlike the typical court beauties who attracted royal attention, Anne possessed intellectual gifts and political awareness that made her a formidable figure in her own right. Her father's position as the king's most trusted advisor complicated the situation further, creating potential conflicts between personal relationships and political necessity. The pregnancy forced James to make a decision that would define much of his subsequent life. Despite pressure from court figures who argued that a royal duke should not marry beneath his station, James chose to honour his commitment to Anne. They were married in a secret ceremony in September of 1660, just weeks before their first child was born. The secret marriage created immediate controversy within the royal family and broader court society. Charles II was reportedly furious at his brother's decision, seeing it as politically damaging and socially inappropriate. The marriage suggested that James lacked the political judgment expected of a royal prince, and might prove equally imprudent in other areas of government. The birth of Charles, Duke of Cambridge, in October 1660, provided the new marriage with its first tragedy. The child lived only 6 months before succumbing to smallpox, one of the leading causes of infant mortality in the 17th century. This loss would be the first of many that would mark James and Anne's marriage, as they would ultimately lose 6 of their 8 children to disease and infant mortality. Despite the tragic loss of their first child, James and Anne's marriage proved to be based on genuine affection and mutual respect. Contemporary observers noted that James, despite his reputation as a libertine, seemed genuinely devoted to his wife and took pleasure in domestic life. This devotion was remarkable in an age when royal marriages were typically arranged for political advantage rather than personal compatibility. Anne's influence on James extended far beyond their personal relationship. She was an intelligent woman with strong opinions about politics and religion, and she used her position as Duchess to advance her own views and those of her family. Her father, the Earl of Clarendon, became one of the most powerful men in England during the early Restoration period, and Anne's marriage to James cemented this influence. The couple's subsequent children faced the same high rate of infant mortality that characterised the era. Mary, born in 1662, and Anne, born in 1665, were the only children to survive to adulthood. Both would eventually become Queens of England, but their childhood was marked by the repeated trauma of losing siblings to diseases that modern medicine could easily prevent. James's marriage to Anne Hyde also exposed him to new religious influences that would prove crucial to his spiritual development. Anne came from a family with complex religious loyalties. While officially Anglican, they maintained connections to both Catholic and Protestant traditions. Anne herself was intellectually curious about religious questions and engaged in theological discussions that influenced James's thinking. The domestic happiness that James found in his marriage contrasted sharply with his public reputation as one of the leading libertines of the Restoration Court. Like his brother Charles II, James maintained relationships with numerous mistresses even after his marriage. This behaviour was typical of royal princes of the era, but it created tensions within his marriage and undermined his moral authority in religious matters. Among James's most notable mistresses was Arabella Churchill, sister of the future Duke of Marlborough. Their relationship produced several illegitimate children, including James Fitz-James, who would later become Duke of Berwick and one of James's most loyal supporters during his exile. These relationships demonstrated James's capacity for maintaining multiple emotional commitments while pursuing his political and military careers. The death of Anne Hyde in March 1671 marked the end of an important chapter in James's personal development. Anne had succumbed to breast cancer after a lengthy illness that had been complicated by her recent conversion to Catholicism. Her deathbed conversion created additional controversy and fueled speculation about James's own religious loyalties. Anne's conversion to Catholicism on her deathbed was seen by many observers as evidence that she had been secretly Catholic for some time. This suspicion extended to James himself, who was already suspected of Catholic sympathies due to his continental military service and his mother's religious influence. The conversion added to the growing concern about the religious direction of the royal family. The loss of his wife forced James to confront his own mortality and spiritual condition. Anne's death came at a time when he was already questioning his Anglican faith and considering the claims of the Catholic Church. Her conversion provided him with a personal connection to Catholicism that complemented the intellectual and political attractions he was beginning to feel toward the Catholic faith. James's first marriage had introduced him to both the joys and sorrows of domestic life, while exposing him to the religious influences that would reshape his spiritual identity. The serious-minded military veteran had discovered that he was capable of deep personal attachments and genuine grief, emotions that would influence his approach to both religion and politics for the rest of his life. The transformation of James from a nominal Anglican to a committed Catholic represented one of the most consequential religious conversions in English history. This change occurred gradually during the late 1660s and early 1670s, driven by a combination of personal, intellectual and political factors that would ultimately shape the destiny of three kingdoms. James's journey toward Catholicism began with questions rather than answers. His continental military service had exposed him to Catholic soldiers and officers whose piety and moral conduct challenged Protestant stereotypes about Catholic corruption and superstition. Unlike the anti-Catholic propaganda that dominated English religious discourse, James had observed Catholics who combined sincere faith with practical competence and personal honour. The intellectual climate of Restoration England, with its emphasis on reason and natural philosophy, created space for religious questioning that had been impossible during the Puritan ascendancy. James, though not naturally scholarly, was influenced by the theological discussions that flourished at court and in fashionable London society. Catholic apologists like Father John Huddleston presented sophisticated arguments for Catholic doctrine that impressed educated Protestants seeking religious certainty. The influence of James's first wife, Anne Hyde, proved crucial to his spiritual development. Anne had engaged in extensive theological reading and discussion before her own conversion to Catholicism, and she shared her insights with her husband during their private conversations. Her intellectual approach to religious questions appealed to James's practical mind and provided him with rational arguments for Catholic claims. The Catholic Restoration in France under Louis XIV provided James with a compelling example of how Catholic monarchy could combine religious orthodoxy with political effectiveness and military success. French power and prosperity seemed to vindicate Catholic claims about the relationship between true religion and temporal success, while Protestant England struggled with political divisions and social conflict. James's conversion was also influenced by his growing disillusionment with Anglican compromise and moderation. The Church of England's attempt to find a middle way between Catholicism and Protestantism struck him as intellectually unsatisfactory and spiritually inadequate. Catholic claims to doctrinal certainty and apostolic authority offered an alternative to what he saw as Anglican ambiguity and political subservience. The personal dimension of James's conversion cannot be ignored. His marriage to Anne Hyde had introduced him to the emotional satisfactions of domestic life, but it had also exposed him to the grief and uncertainty that accompanied the loss of children to disease and early death. Catholic teachings about salvation, purgatory, and the intercession of saints offered comfort that Anglican theology seemed unable to provide. The process of conversion was gradual and secretive. James began attending private Catholic masses at court, initially out of curiosity but increasingly out of conviction. He engaged in lengthy discussions with Catholic priests and learned laymen, testing their arguments against his own Protestant background and continental experience. The conversion represented both intellectual acceptance and emotional commitment to a new understanding of Christianity. By 1668 or 1669, James had reached the point of no return in his spiritual journey. He began receiving Catholic communion privately, while continuing to attend Anglican services publicly, a compromise that reflected both his genuine conversion and his awareness of the political dangers involved. The deception was necessary but personally troubling, as it forced him to live a double life that contradicted his natural honesty. The secrecy surrounding James's conversion created its own problems. Rumours circulated at court and beyond about the Duke's religious loyalties, fuelled by his known associations with Catholic courtiers and his wife's deathbed conversion. These rumours were impossible to deny completely without lying, but acknowledging them would have created immediate political crisis. James's conversion had immediate implications for his personal relationships and court position. Some of his closest associates, learning of his new faith, distanced themselves to avoid political contamination. Others, particularly those with Catholic sympathies of their own, drew closer to the Duke in expectation of future advancement. The religious question became inseparable from considerations of political loyalty and personal advancement. The theological aspects of James's conversion reflected the intellectual climate of his era. Catholic arguments about apostolic succession, papal authority, and sacramental efficacy appealed to his desire for religious certainty and clear authority. The Catholic emphasis on tradition and continuity resonated with his monarchist convictions and his belief in the importance of legitimate succession in both church and state. The conversion also reflected James's continental perspective on European politics and religion. From his military service in Catholic armies, he had learned to see Protestantism as a recent innovation that had disrupted the natural order of Christendom. Catholic restoration seemed to represent a return to normalcy rather than revolutionary change, an interpretation that would influence his later policies as king. The political implications of James's conversion were profound, though their full significance would not become apparent for several years. By embracing Catholicism, James had aligned himself with a religious minority that faced legal disabilities and popular hostility. He had also connected himself to international Catholic networks that included France and other powers that many English people viewed as national enemies. Most significantly, James's conversion represented a fundamental misunderstanding of English religious and political development. He had embraced a faith that the majority of his future subjects regarded as foreign, superstitious, and politically dangerous. The sincere religious conviction that brought him personal peace would ultimately cost him 3 crowns and alter the course of British constitutional development. The Duke who emerged from this spiritual transformation was a different man from the Anglican prince who'd returned from exile in 1660. James had found religious certainty and personal peace, but he had also acquired commitments that would prove impossible to reconcile with the responsibilities of English kingship in a Protestant nation. The restoration of the monarchy in 1660 brought with it the revival of ancient offices and ceremonial positions that had been abolished during the Commonwealth period. For James, Duke of York, the most significant of these was his appointment as Lord High Admiral, a position that would define much of his public career and establish his reputation as an able administrator and naval commander. The office of Lord High Admiral carried with it comprehensive authority over the Royal Navy, England's primary instrument of national defence and commercial expansion. James took his responsibilities seriously, involving himself in every aspect of naval administration, from ship design and construction to officer training and strategic planning. His attention to detail and practical experience of military affairs made him an effective naval administrator during a crucial period of English maritime expansion. The England that James returned to in 1660 was in the process of becoming a major maritime power. The Commonwealth period had seen significant naval development, with the creation of a professional officer corps and the construction of larger, more heavily armed warships. James inherited this naval inheritance and built upon it, overseeing further expansion and modernisation that would establish English naval supremacy for the next 2 centuries. James's first major test as Lord High Admiral came with the Second Dutch War, which began in 1665. This conflict arose from commercial rivalry between England and the Netherlands, 2 Protestant nations competing for dominance of European and Atlantic trade. The war would provide James with his first opportunity to demonstrate his abilities as a naval commander and strategic planner. The Battle of Lowestoft in June 1665 marked James's debut as a fleet commander. Leading the English fleet from his flagship, the Royal Charles, James demonstrated both personal courage and tactical competence in a hard-fought engagement against the Dutch fleet commanded by Admiral Opdam. The battle resulted in a decisive English victory that established James's reputation as a capable military leader. The victory at Lowestoft came at considerable personal cost to James. During the height of the battle, a single Dutch cannonball killed 3 courtiers standing beside him on the deck of the Royal Charles, spattering the Duke with blood and brain matter. The experience provided James with a visceral understanding of the reality of naval warfare and reinforced his respect for the professional sailors who served under his command. Following his success at Lowestoft, James found his active naval career curtailed by his brother's concerns for the royal succession. Charles II, still without legitimate heirs, could not risk losing his heir presumptive in battle. James was recalled from active fleet command despite his protests, a decision that frustrated his military ambitions but demonstrated the political importance of his position as heir to the throne. The administrative aspects of James's naval career proved equally significant. He oversaw major reforms in naval organisation, officer training, and ship design that modernised the Royal Navy and improved its effectiveness. His practical experience of military service gave him insights into the needs of ordinary sailors and officers that proved valuable in developing naval policy. James's naval administration was marked by attention to technical innovation and professional development. He supported advances in navigation, gunnery, and ship construction that kept the English fleet competitive with its European rivals. His encouragement of naval education and his establishment of clear promotion criteria helped create the professional officer corps that would dominate European waters for the next century. The Duke's involvement in colonial and commercial affairs through his naval position exposed him to the broader implications of English maritime expansion. The Royal Navy protected merchant shipping, supported colonial settlements, and enforced trade regulations that were creating England's first overseas empire. James developed an understanding of imperial administration that would influence his later policies as king. The Third Dutch War of 1672 to 1674 provided James with another opportunity for active fleet command. though this conflict proved more challenging than its predecessor. The Battle of Solebay in 1672 saw James again leading the English fleet, but this time against a combined Dutch-French force that presented formidable opposition. The battle demonstrated both James's continued courage and the growing complexity of European naval warfare. At Solebay, James was forced to transfer his flag twice, as successive flagships were disabled by enemy action. Throughout the engagement, he maintained his position on deck, encouraging gun crews and directing the battle despite the obvious danger to his person. This display of leadership under fire enhanced his reputation among naval officers and demonstrated his commitment to his military responsibilities. The inconclusive results of the Third Dutch War highlighted the limitations of naval power in achieving political objectives. Despite English naval superiority, the war ended in stalemate, with neither side achieving decisive victory. James learned valuable lessons about the relationship between military success and political achievement that would influence his approach to kingship. James's naval career also involved him in less savoury aspects of English maritime expansion. As governor of the Royal African Company, he oversaw England's participation in the Atlantic slave trade, a connection that would haunt his historical reputation. The profits from slave trading helped finance naval expansion, creating a direct link between English maritime power and human bondage. The technical and administrative skills that James developed as Lord High Admiral served him well in other areas of government service. His experience managing large organisations, coordinating complex operations, and maintaining discipline under pressure proved valuable in various administrative roles throughout his career. The Navy provided him with a model of efficient hierarchical organisation that he would later attempt to apply to civilian government. Most importantly, James's naval service reinforced his belief in the importance of professional competence, personal courage, and clear authority in government affairs. The Navy worked because everyone understood their role, followed orders, and accepted the necessity of discipline. These lessons would influence James's approach to kingship, though the application of military principles to civilian politics would prove problematic. The Duke of York, who stepped down from active naval command in the 1670s, had established himself as one of England's most competent military administrators. His reforms and innovations had modernised the Royal Navy and positioned it for the global dominance it would achieve in the following century. Unfortunately, the same qualities that made him an effective naval commander would prove inadequate for the more complex challenges of ruling a divided kingdom in an age of religious and political upheaval. The year 1673 marked a turning point in James's life that would eventually lead to his downfall as king. The Test Act, passed by Parliament in response to growing fears of Catholic influence in government, required all holders of civil and military office to take an oath denying Catholic doctrine and receive Anglican communion. For James, whose secret conversion to Catholicism was becoming increasingly difficult to conceal, the act presented an impossible choice between his faith and his career. The background to the Test Act lay in the complex religious and political tensions that had persisted since the Restoration. Despite Charles II's promises of religious toleration, Protestant England remained deeply suspicious of Catholic influence at court. The King's secret Treaty of Dover with Louis XIV, which promised English support for French foreign policy in exchange for subsidies, had leaked partially to Parliament, creating fears of a Catholic conspiracy to subvert English independence. Popular anti-Catholic sentiment was further inflamed by Louis XIV's aggressive foreign policy and his persecution of French Protestants. English observers watched with alarm as the Sun King extended French power throughout Europe while suppressing Protestant worship within his own territories. The possibility that England might be drawn into this orbit of Catholic absolutism terrified Protestant parliamentarians and their constituents. The immediate trigger for the Test Act was the Declaration of Indulgence issued by Charles II in 1672, which suspended penal laws against both Catholics and Protestant dissenters. While officially even-handedly tolerant, the declaration was widely seen as a backdoor method of advancing Catholic interests. Parliament responded by refusing to grant supply, until the declaration was withdrawn and additional safeguards against Catholic influence were enacted. For James, the Test Act represented a crisis that had been building since his conversion to Catholicism several years earlier. As Lord High Admiral, he fell directly under the Act's provisions and would be required to take the oath and receive Anglican communion to retain his position. His refusal would constitute public acknowledgement of his Catholic faith, with all the political consequences that would follow. The Duke struggled with his decision throughout the spring of 1673. His Catholic faith had become central to his personal identity and spiritual life, making compromise on religious grounds virtually impossible. Yet resignation from the Admiralty would confirm the worst suspicions of his critics and potentially damage the monarchy's position more broadly. There seemed no way to avoid a public crisis. James's advisers were divided on the course he should pursue. Some urged him to take the oath and receive communion as a matter of political necessity, arguing that external conformity was compatible with internal Catholic belief. Others insisted that such compromise would constitute apostasy and spiritual damnation. The Duke found himself torn between conflicting loyalties and authorities. The religious dimensions of James's dilemma reflected broader theological debates within the Catholic Church about accommodation with Protestant regimes. Some Catholic theologians argued that external conformity could be justified when necessary to prevent greater harm to the Catholic cause. Others maintained that any compromise with heretical worship constituted mortal sin and spiritual rebellion against papal authority. James's decision to resign rather than take the oath was consistent with his character and religious convictions. Throughout his life, he had demonstrated a preference for straightforward action over complex political manoeuvring. His military background had taught him to value clear principles and decisive action, qualities that served him poorly in the ambiguous world of parliamentary politics. The resignation from the Admiralty in June 1673 created the public crisis that James had hoped to avoid. His refusal to take the oath confirmed widespread suspicions about his religious loyalties and made him a focal point for anti-Catholic sentiment. The heir presumptive to the throne had publicly identified himself with a faith that the majority of his future subjects regarded as foreign and dangerous. The immediate aftermath of James's resignation saw a dramatic increase in anti-Catholic agitation throughout England. Pamphlets and sermons warned of popish plots to subvert English liberties and Protestant religion. The Duke found himself depicted as the centrepiece of an international Catholic conspiracy directed from Rome and supported by French gold. These accusations, while largely unfounded, reflected genuine fears about the direction of English religious and political development. Charles II attempted to limit the damage caused by his brother's resignation by emphasising continuity in other areas of government policy. The king maintained his public commitment to the Church of England, while privately supporting James's right to follow his conscience in religious matters. This delicate balancing act satisfied neither committed Protestants nor convinced Catholics, creating ongoing political instability. The Test Act crisis also marked the beginning of James's second marriage negotiations. His first wife, Anne Hyde, had died in 1671, leaving him free to remarry. The search for a suitable second wife became entangled with the religious controversy surrounding his Catholic conversion, as Protestant critics argued that any Catholic bride would confirm their worst fears about the future direction of the monarchy. James's eventual marriage to Mary of Modena, a 15-year-old Italian Catholic princess, was announced just months after his resignation from the Admiralty. The timing seemed to confirm that his religious conversion was complete and irreversible. Protestant critics argued that the marriage was part of a broader Catholic strategy to capture the English throne for international Catholicism. The Test Act crisis established patterns that would characterise the remainder of James's career before becoming king. His refusal to compromise on religious matters, his tendency to see political opposition as religious persecution, and his reliance on a narrow circle of Catholic advisers all stemmed from his response to the 1673 crisis. The straightforward military commander had learned to see politics as a form of warfare between irreconcilable religious communities. Most importantly, the crisis demonstrated James's fundamental misunderstanding of English political culture. His assumption that religious sincerity would be respected and that personal honour mattered more than political expediency was naive in the context of post-Restoration politics. The heir who had sacrificed his career for his conscience had also sacrificed much of his political effectiveness and popular support. The Duke who emerged from the Test Act crisis was a different figure from the successful Lord High Admiral who had preceded it. James had gained religious authenticity and personal integrity at the cost of political flexibility and popular acceptance. The trade-off would define the remainder of his career and ultimately contribute to his loss of 3 kingdoms in the Glorious Revolution. The late 1670s brought to England one of the most extraordinary episodes of mass hysteria in the nation's history. The Popish Plot, as it came to be known, was a fabricated conspiracy that claimed to expose a Catholic scheme to assassinate Charles II, massacre English Protestants, and place James on the throne as a puppet of the Pope and Louis XIV. For James himself, the plot represented both vindication and crisis, as it simultaneously proved his loyalty to his brother while confirming his dangerous religious associations. The architect of this imaginary conspiracy was Titus Oates, a disgraced Anglican clergyman whose personal failures had led him through various religious communities before settling on anti-Catholic agitation as a career. Oates possessed the dangerous combination of detailed knowledge of Catholic practices, unlimited imagination, and complete absence of moral scruples that made him an effective fabricator of conspiracy theories. Oates's story, first presented to London magistrate Sir Edmund Berry Godfrey in September 1678, claimed that English Catholics were plotting to kill Charles II through poison, shooting or stabbing, after which they would massacre Protestant nobility and install James as a Catholic king. According to Oates, this plot involved hundreds of conspirators, including prominent Catholic nobles, Jesuit priests and foreign agents working on behalf of France and the papacy. The initial reception of Oates's allegations was sceptical, as his story contained obvious inconsistencies and his personal credibility was questionable. However, the mysterious murder of Sir Edmund Berry Godfrey just weeks after receiving Oates's testimony transformed scepticism into panic. Godfrey's body was found in a ditch on Primrose Hill, apparently strangled and then run through with his own sword, creating the appearance of Catholic assassination. The murder of Godfrey, whether connected to the Popish, plot or not, provided the dramatic confirmation that Oates's story seemed to require. Popular opinion, already suspicious of Catholic influence at court, accepted the murder as proof that a vast conspiracy really existed. Anti-Catholic hysteria swept through London and quickly spread throughout England, creating a climate of fear and suspicion that would persist for several years. Parliament, dominated by members already hostile to Catholic influence, embraced Oates's revelations with enthusiasm. Special committees were established to investigate the plot, and substantial rewards were offered for information about Catholic conspirators. The House of Commons used the crisis to demand new restrictions on Catholic worship and additional safeguards against Catholic influence in government. For James, the Popish plot created a complex and dangerous situation. As the alleged beneficiary of the conspiracy, he was simultaneously victim and suspect in the public mind. His known Catholic faith made him seem plausible as the figurehead of a Catholic plot, while his genuine loyalty to his brother contradicted the central claim that he was actively seeking to usurp the throne through assassination. James's response to the crisis demonstrated both his personal integrity and his political naivety. He cooperated fully with parliamentary investigations, providing testimony about his knowledge of accused conspirators and his own religious practices. His straightforward answers satisfied investigators about his personal innocence, but confirmed suspicions about his religious loyalties and political associations. The Duke's willingness to testify publicly about his Catholic faith marked another stage in his journey from secret convert to open Catholic. While he continued to deny any involvement in treasonable activity, James no longer attempted to conceal his religious convictions. This honesty, while admirable in personal terms, further inflamed Protestant suspicions about his suitability as a future king. The judicial proceedings that followed Oates's allegations resulted in the execution of numerous innocent Catholics based on perjured testimony and fabricated evidence. James watched with horror as men he knew to be innocent were condemned to death by courts willing to accept almost any evidence against alleged Catholic conspirators. The experience reinforced his sense that English Protestantism was fundamentally hostile to justice and tolerance. The political impact of the Popish plot extended far beyond the immediate victims of judicial murder. Anti-Catholic sentiment reached levels not seen since the reign of Elizabeth I, with popular demonstrations, inflammatory sermons, and violent attacks on Catholic property occurring throughout England. The climate of hysteria made rational discussion of religious policy virtually impossible. Charles II's response to the crisis demonstrated his superior political instincts compared to his brother. While privately sceptical of Oates's allegations, the king publicly supported the investigations while quietly working to limit their scope and protect innocent Catholics from persecution. Charles understood that direct confrontation with popular hysteria would only strengthen his enemies and endanger the monarchy. The Popish plot also provided the background for the exclusion crisis that would dominate English politics for the next several years. Protestant parliamentarians, convinced that James represented a genuine threat to English liberty and religion, began organising systematic opposition to his succession to the throne. The fabricated conspiracy had created real political consequences that would shape the remainder of James's career. The international dimensions of the Popish plot reflected broader European concerns about Catholic power and French expansion. Louis XIV's revocation of the Edict of Nantes in 1685 seemed to vindicate English fears about Catholic intolerance, while French military successes suggested that Catholic powers were indeed gaining strength throughout Europe. These real concerns gave credibility to even fantastic allegations about domestic Catholic conspiracies. For James personally, the Popish plot period was marked by isolation and frustration. His genuine innocence of treasonable activity could not overcome suspicions created by his religious faith and his association with other Catholics. The experience taught him that English Protestantism was not merely a different religious tradition, but an actively hostile force that would never accept Catholic participation in English political life. The hysteria surrounding the Popish plot eventually subsided, as Oates's credibility collapsed under scrutiny, and the initial panic gave way to more sober analysis. However, the political damage had been done. James's reputation was permanently tainted by association with the alleged conspiracy, and the precedent had been established for parliamentary opposition to his succession based on religious grounds. The Duke who survived the Popish plot was a more isolated and embittered figure than the man who had entered the crisis. James had learned that his religious faith made him a permanent target of Protestant suspicion, and that his political enemies would use any available weapon against him. These lessons would influence his approach to kingship and contribute to the inflexibility that would ultimately cost him his throne. The Popish plot hysteria created the perfect storm for the most serious constitutional crisis since the English Civil War. Between 1679 and 1681, 3 successive parliaments attempted to exclude James from the royal succession solely because of his Catholic faith. The exclusion crisis, as historians have termed it, represented the first systematic attempt to alter the hereditary principle of monarchy based on religious considerations, and it would define the remainder of James's pre-royal career. The driving force behind the exclusion movement was Anthony Ashley Cooper, Earl of Shaftesbury, a brilliant politician who had served both Charles I and Oliver Cromwell before becoming one of Charles II's most important ministers. Shaftesbury possessed the rare combination of principled Protestant conviction and ruthless political ambition that made him a formidable leader of parliamentary opposition to Catholic succession. Shaftesbury's strategy was elegantly simple. If James's Catholicism made him unsuitable to rule Protestant England, then Parliament should exclude him from the succession and designate an alternative heir. The most obvious candidate was James Scott, Duke of Monmouth, Charles II's eldest illegitimate son, who possessed both Protestant credentials and considerable personal charm. Monmouth's illegitimate birth could be overlooked, Shaftesbury argued, in the interest of preserving Protestant monarchy. The first Exclusion Parliament convened in March 1679 with a substantial majority opposed to Catholic succession. The House of Commons quickly passed a resolution declaring that the succession of a Catholic prince would be dangerous to the kingdom's peace and the Protestant religion. The stage was set for a confrontation between parliamentary authority and hereditary monarchy that would echo the conflicts of the 1640s. James's response to the Exclusion Campaign revealed both his strengths and weaknesses as a political figure. He refused to consider conversion to Protestantism as a means of preserving his inheritance, demonstrating the religious conviction that had already cost him his naval career. However, his inflexibility also prevented him from seeking the kind of compromise that might have preserved both his succession rights and parliamentary confidence. The debates over exclusion revealed fundamental disagreements about the nature of monarchy and the source of political authority. Exclusionists argued that Parliament possessed the right to alter the succession in the national interest, while their opponents maintained that hereditary right was divinely ordained and could not be changed by human authority. These competing theories of government had no middle ground for compromise. Charles II's masterful handling of the exclusion crisis demonstrated political skills that his brother would never possess. Rather than confronting Parliament directly, the king dissolved successive assemblies when exclusion bills gained momentum, called new elections in the hope of better results, and used his prerogative powers to prevent final passage of exclusion legislation. The strategy succeeded in protecting James's rights, while avoiding the kind of direct confrontation that had destroyed their father. The exclusion debates also gave birth to England's first recognisable political parties. The Whigs, as supporters of exclusion came to be known, developed sophisticated arguments about parliamentary sovereignty and the contractual nature of government. Their opponents, dubbed Tories, defended hereditary monarchy and divine right while arguing that religious differences were less important than constitutional stability. James's own role during the exclusion crisis was largely passive, reflecting both his political inexperience and his precarious position as the target of parliamentary attack. He spent much of the period in exile, first in Brussels and later in Scotland, where his presence could not be used to inflame anti-Catholic sentiment in England. This absence, while politically necessary, also prevented him from building the kind of personal relationships that might have moderated opposition to his succession. The campaign for Monmouth's legitimisation as an alternative to James revealed the desperation of exclusionist politicians. Despite extensive efforts to find evidence that Charles II had secretly married Monmouth's mother, Lucy Walter, no credible proof could be produced. The failure of this strategy forced exclusionists to fall back on parliamentary authority as the sole basis for altering the succession, a position that many found constitutionally questionable. The Second Exclusion Parliament, which met in October 1680, proved even more hostile to James than its predecessor. The House of Commons passed an exclusion bill by a substantial majority, leading to dramatic scenes as the legislation moved toward the House of Lords. Only Charles II's dissolution of Parliament prevented a final vote that might have excluded James from the throne by statute. James's appointment as Lord High Commissioner of Scotland during this period provided him with valuable administrative experience while removing him from the English political scene. In Edinburgh, he demonstrated considerable skill in managing Scottish affairs, building relationships with local nobles and clergy that would prove valuable during his later reign. The Scottish experience also reinforced his belief in the effectiveness of firm, personal government. The final phase of the exclusion crisis came with the Oxford Parliament of 1681, Charles II's masterstroke in defeating his parliamentary opponents. By summoning Parliament to meet in Oxford rather than Westminster, the king placed exclusionist members in an uncomfortable position, surrounded by royalist Oxford University rather than their London supporters. The tactic worked brilliantly, allowing Charles to dissolve Parliament after just 1 week without appearing to fear parliamentary authority. The collapse of the exclusion movement marked a personal victory for James, but it also revealed the fragility of his position. While he had retained his succession rights, he had lost the confidence of a substantial portion of the English political elite. The exclusion crisis had established the precedent for religious opposition to his rule and created networks of organised resistance that would prove crucial during the Glorious Revolution. The constitutional implications of the exclusion crisis extended far beyond James's personal situation. The debates had raised fundamental questions about the relationship between monarchy and parliament, the role of religion in politics, and the nature of political obligation. While the immediate crisis had been resolved in favour of hereditary monarchy, the underlying issues remained unresolved and would resurface with even greater force during James's reign. The propaganda war that accompanied the exclusion crisis also shaped public opinion about James and Catholic monarchy more generally. Whig pamphlets and sermons created a lasting association between Catholicism and political tyranny that would influence English political culture for generations. James emerged from the crisis with his succession rights intact, but his reputation permanently damaged among the Protestant majority of his future subjects. The personal cost of the exclusion crisis for James was enormous. The experience confirmed his suspicion that English Protestantism was fundamentally hostile to Catholics and convinced him that compromise with parliamentary opposition was both impossible and morally wrong. These lessons would guide his approach to kingship and contribute to the inflexibility that would ultimately destroy his reign. Most significantly, the exclusion crisis established the template for the Glorious Revolution that would end James's reign. The same arguments about parliamentary authority, religious liberty, and the conditional nature of political obedience that had been developed during the exclusion debates would be revived and refined during the Revolution. The politicians who had learned to organise systematic opposition to James during the 1680s would apply those skills with devastating effectiveness in 1688. The Duke who survived the exclusion crisis was a marked man, heir to a throne that a substantial portion of the political elite believed he should never occupy. The victory that preserved his succession rights had also established the conditions that would make his eventual reign brief, troubled, and ultimately unsuccessful. The exclusion crisis had been won, but at a cost that would ultimately prove too high to bear. The defeat of the exclusion movement in 1681 marked the beginning of a strange interlude in James's life, a period when he remained heir to the throne but was effectively excluded from meaningful participation in English political life. These wilderness years, as they might be termed, saw James developing the administrative skills and political relationships that would characterise his brief reign, while also deepening the religious and ideological commitments that would ultimately destroy it. Charles II's solution to the James problem was characteristically subtle and effective. Rather than keeping his controversial brother at court where his presence might rekindle exclusionist sentiment, the king appointed James as Lord High Commissioner of Scotland, a position that provided him with valuable executive experience while removing him from English politics. The appointment was both reward and exile, recognition and quarantine. Scotland in the 1680s presented unique challenges that tested James's administrative abilities and political judgment. The kingdom remained deeply divided between Episcopalians loyal to the established church and Presbyterians who rejected episcopal authority and royal supremacy in religious matters. James's task was to maintain royal authority while managing these religious divisions without inflaming the situation beyond repair. James's approach to Scottish governance revealed both his strengths and limitations as an administrator. He demonstrated considerable personal charm in dealing with Scottish nobles and clergy, building relationships based on mutual respect and shared interests. His military background served him well in understanding the strategic importance of Scotland and the need to maintain effective defences against potential invasion. The religious policy that James pursued in Scotland foreshadowed his later approach as King of England. While maintaining official support for the established Episcopal Church, he showed considerable tolerance for Catholic worship and even limited indulgence for Presbyterian dissent. This policy reflected both pragmatic political calculation and his developing belief in the benefits of religious tolerance. James's Scottish experience also reinforced his conviction that effective government required strong executive authority and minimal interference from representative assemblies. The Scottish Parliament was less assertive than its English counterpart, and James found that he could govern more effectively without constant parliamentary opposition. These lessons would influence his later attempts to rule England without regular parliamentary sessions. The social life of Edinburgh during James's residency was notable for its relative religious harmony. Catholics, Episcopalians, and even some Presbyterians participated in court functions and social gatherings without the kind of sectarian hostility that characterized English society. James's personal example of tolerance and his wife Mary of Modena's graciousness helped create an atmosphere of mutual respect that was rare in 17th century Europe. The military aspects of James's Scottish service proved particularly valuable in preparing him for kingship. Scotland's exposed position relative to potential foreign invasion required constant attention to defence preparations, naval patrols and intelligence gathering. James's experience as Lord High Admiral served him well in coordinating these activities and maintaining effective communication with London. James's relationship with Scottish Presbyterian leaders during this period was complex and ultimately tragic. While he showed considerable tolerance for their religious practices, Presbyterian leaders remained suspicious of his Catholic faith and his long-term intentions. The mutual respect that developed between James and individual Presbyterian ministers was not enough to overcome the fundamental theological and political differences that separated them. The administrative reforms that James initiated in Scotland demonstrated his capacity for effective government when freed from parliamentary interference. He streamlined tax collection, improved judicial procedures, and enhanced military organisation in ways that increased both royal revenue and governmental efficiency. These successes convinced him that similar reforms could be implemented in England given sufficient royal authority. Personal tragedy marked James's Scottish years with the death of several of his children with Mary of Modena. The couple's repeated experience of infant mortality created deep emotional bonds between them, while also intensifying James's religious convictions. The Catholic emphasis on prayer for the dead and the intercession of saints provided comfort that Protestant theology seemed unable to offer. The cultural life of Edinburgh during James's residency flourished under his patronage. He supported local artists, musicians and writers, while also importing continental influences that enriched Scottish intellectual life. The court became a centre of learning and artistic achievement that rivaled anything in contemporary Europe, demonstrating James's appreciation for the civilising influence of royal patronage. James's Scottish correspondence with his brother reveals the development of his political philosophy during these years. He consistently argued for stronger royal authority, more limited parliamentary power, and greater religious tolerance as solutions to the problems facing the Stuart monarchy. These ideas, developed in the relative isolation of Edinburgh, would shape his later policies as king with disastrous consequences. The intelligence network that James developed during his Scottish service provided him with valuable insights into both domestic and international affairs. Scottish merchants and soldiers maintained extensive contacts throughout Europe, giving James access to information about foreign courts, military developments, and political trends that would prove valuable during his reign. The question of James's eventual succession to the English throne remained constantly in the background during his Scottish years. While the exclusion crisis had been defeated, the underlying concerns about Catholic monarchy had not disappeared. James's Scottish experience convinced him that effective royal government could overcome religious objections, a calculation that would prove fatally optimistic. The transformation that occurred in James during his Scottish exile was profound but subtle. He emerged as a more confident administrator, a more sophisticated politician, and a more committed Catholic. Unfortunately, he also developed an overconfidence in his ability to manage religious and political opposition that would prove his undoing when he finally gained the throne. The skills that James acquired during his Scottish wilderness years, administrative competence, military experience, and diplomatic sophistication, were precisely what England needed in a king. Tragically, the ideological commitments and political assumptions that he also developed during this period were exactly what would make his reign impossible to sustain in a Protestant kingdom suspicious of royal authority. The year 1683 brought with it a conspiracy that would dramatically alter the political landscape of Restoration England and provide James with his most significant political victory since the defeat of the Exclusion Movement. The Rye House plot, named for the Hertfordshire manor house where conspirators allegedly planned to assassinate Charles II and James, represented the violent culmination of exclusionist politics and would ultimately strengthen rather than weaken James's position as heir to the throne. The origins of the Rye House plot lay in the frustration of radical Whigs following the collapse of legal exclusion efforts in 1681. Unable to achieve their goals through parliamentary means, some exclusionists had begun considering more direct action against the Stuart brothers. The plot that emerged combined genuine revolutionary planning with the kind of loose talk and wishful thinking that often surrounded political opposition in the 17th century. The conspiracy involved two distinct groups with somewhat different objectives. The more moderate faction, led by prominent Whig nobles, hoped to force Charles II to exclude James from the succession and summon a new parliament. The radical wing, dominated by former Commonwealth soldiers and Republican idealists, aimed at nothing less than the complete overthrow of the monarchy and the establishment of a new Republican government. Lord William Russell and Algernon Sidney, two of the most prominent Whig leaders, became deeply involved in the conspiracy despite their previous commitment to legal and constitutional methods of opposition. Their participation demonstrated the desperation that had seized exclusionist leaders following their parliamentary defeats and their willingness to consider extreme measures to prevent Catholic succession. The Duke of Monmouth, Charles II's illegitimate son, and the focus of earlier exclusionist hopes, also became implicated in the plot. His involvement was particularly damaging to the royal family, as it suggested that even the king's own son was willing to participate in violent opposition to his father's government. The betrayal of family loyalty shocked contemporary observers and damaged Monmouth's reputation permanently. The specific details of the assassination plot, as revealed during subsequent investigations, demonstrated both the seriousness of the conspirators' intentions and the amateurish nature of their planning. The scheme involved ambushing the royal brothers as they returned from horse, racing at Newmarket, using the narrow lanes near Rye House to trap their coach and overwhelm their guards. The plan might have succeeded had Charles and James followed their usual schedule. The discovery of the plot came through a combination of government intelligence work and conspirators' indiscretions. Several plotters had talked too freely about their plans, while government agents had infiltrated some of the planning meetings. When arrests began in June 1683, the full scope of the conspiracy quickly became apparent, shocking even those who had been aware of growing opposition sentiment. The trials that followed the discovery of the Rye House plot provided James with his greatest political vindication since the Restoration. The revelation that prominent Whigs had been planning regicide discredited the entire exclusionist movement and generated a wave of popular sympathy for the royal family. James, who had been the target of assassination along with his brother, emerged as a victim rather than a threat. Lord Russell's trial and execution in July 1683 marked the destruction of Whig leadership and the effective end of organised opposition to James's succession. Russell's dignity in facing death impressed even his enemies, but his involvement in assassination plots had fatally damaged the moral authority of the exclusionist cause. The execution removed one of James's most capable opponents and intimidated others into submission or exile. Algernon Sidney's trial provided the government with another opportunity to expose the Republican ideology that lay behind exclusionist politics. Sidney's Republican writings, used as evidence against him, revealed the radical agenda that moderate exclusionists had tried to conceal. His execution in December 1683 completed the destruction of the intellectual leadership of the opposition movement. The Earl of Essex's suicide in the Tower of London while awaiting trial created additional drama and controversy surrounding the plot. Essex had been one of the most respected Whig leaders, and his death deprived the opposition of another potential leader, while raising questions about the government's treatment of prisoners. The suicide also eliminated a witness who might have provided damaging testimony about other conspirators. Monmouth's involvement in the plot created a personal crisis for Charles II, who genuinely loved his illegitimate son despite his political activities. The king's eventual decision to spare Monmouth's life while exiling him to the continent demonstrated both paternal affection and political calculation. Monmouth's survival would create future problems, but his exile removed him as an immediate threat to royal authority. The international implications of the Rye House plot were significant, as several foreign governments had been monitoring English political developments with interest. The French government, in particular, had been providing financial support to some English opposition, figures hoping to prevent English participation in anti-French alliances. The exposure of the plot damaged these networks and strengthened Charles II's position in European diplomacy. For James personally, the Rye House plot represented both vindication and warning. The discovery that prominent political figures had been planning his assassination confirmed his belief that English Protestantism was fundamentally hostile to Catholics and willing to use any means necessary to prevent Catholic rule. The experience reinforced his tendency to see political opposition as criminal conspiracy rather than legitimate dissent. The propaganda victory that the government achieved through exposing the Rye House plot was enormous. Royal publicists effectively portrayed the conspiracy as proof that exclusionist politics inevitably led to regicide and revolution. The association between Whig politics and violent extremism would handicap parliamentary opposition for years to come and strengthen support for hereditary monarchy. The plot's discovery also provided Charles II with the opportunity to restructure English politics in favour of royal authority. The king used the crisis to purge Whig office holders, remodel borough corporations, and strengthen royal control over local government. These changes created a more favourable political environment for James's eventual succession, while demonstrating the effectiveness of decisive royal action. The psychological impact of the Rye House plot on James was profound and lasting. Having faced the possibility of violent death at the hands of his political enemies, he developed an even deeper suspicion of parliamentary opposition and Protestant extremism. The experience convinced him that compromise with such enemies was both impossible and morally wrong, an attitude that would characterise his later reign. Most importantly, the Rye House plot eliminated the most capable and determined opponents of James's succession, while discrediting the political movement that had sustained opposition to Catholic rule. The Whig party would eventually recover from this disaster, but not in time to prevent James's accession to the throne. The plot's failure had cleared the path to power for the future Catholic king, while confirming his belief that such power could only be maintained through strength and determination. On a seemingly routine voyage in May 1682, James's life was forever changed by a maritime disaster that claimed hundreds of lives and provided him with a brush with death that would profoundly influence his understanding of divine providence and royal destiny. The wreck of HMS Gloucester off the Yorkshire coast represented both personal trauma and political opportunity, as James's survival was interpreted by supporters as evidence of divine favour for his eventual kingship. The voyage that ended in disaster had begun as a pleasant excursion designed to demonstrate royal confidence in the aftermath of the exclusion crisis. James, accompanied by a substantial entourage of courtiers, servants and naval officers, was sailing from London to Edinburgh to resume his duties as Lord High Commissioner of Scotland. The journey by sea was intended to avoid the political complications that might arise from travelling overland through areas where exclusionist sentiment remained strong. HMS Gloucester was one of the Royal Navy's most impressive frigates, a 60-gun ship that represented the latest developments in naval architecture and armament. The vessel had been chosen for the voyage not only because of its speed and seaworthiness, but also because its imposing presence would reflect the dignity and power of the royal passenger it carried. The ship's reputation for reliability made the subsequent disaster all the more shocking. The disaster began with a navigational dispute that revealed both James's naval expertise and his fatal inflexibility in matters of authority. As the ship approached the treacherous sandbanks off the Yorkshire coast, James disagreed with the pilot about the correct course to take. Drawing on his extensive experience as Lord High Admiral, James insisted on a route that he believed would avoid the known hazards of the area. The argument between James and the ship's pilot reflected broader tensions about authority and expertise that would characterise James's later reign. The pilot, James Ayres, was an experienced local navigator who knew the treacherous waters intimately, but James's royal status and naval background gave his opinions considerable weight. The dispute highlighted the difficulty of challenging royal authority, even when such authority might be mistaken. The actual grounding occurred in the early morning hours of May 6th, 1682, when HMS Gloucester struck the Lemon and Oar sandbank with tremendous force. The impact was so severe that the ship's hull was immediately breached, and water began pouring into the lower decks. Within minutes, it became clear that the vessel was doomed, and that evacuation would be necessary to save lives. James's behaviour during the crisis revealed both admirable courage and problematic priorities that would later characterise his kingship. Rather than immediately abandoning ship, he insisted on saving his personal possessions, including important papers and religious items. This delay, while understandable from a personal perspective, may have contributed to the heavy loss of life that followed. The evacuation of the sinking vessel was chaotic and tragic. The ship's boats could accommodate only a fraction of the 330 people aboard, and panic quickly spread as it became clear that many would not survive. James secured a place in one of the first boats to leave the ship, a decision that was both sensible and controversial. While his survival was essential for political stability, his early departure, while others remained trapped aboard, created lasting criticism. The human cost of the disaster was enormous. Contemporary accounts suggest that between 130 and 250 people perished in the wreck, including many courtiers, servants, and sailors who had no means of escape once the ship began to break apart. The dead included both prominent figures and humble servants, creating a sense of shared tragedy that transcended social boundaries. Among the notable casualties was George Legge, Lord Dartmouth, one of James's closest friends and most trusted advisers. Dartmouth's death represented not only a personal loss for James, but also the elimination of one of the few moderate voices in his inner circle. The subsequent influence of more extreme advisers would prove problematic during James's reign. The survival of James himself was widely interpreted as miraculous, both by his supporters and by the Duke himself. Contemporary accounts describe him as remaining remarkably calm during the crisis, directing rescue efforts and maintaining his composure even as the ship broke apart around him. This behaviour enhanced his reputation for personal courage, while also suggesting divine protection for his future kingship. The political implications of James's survival were immediately apparent to both supporters and opponents. Royalist propagandists portrayed the rescue as evidence that God had preserved James for his destined role as king, while critics suggested that his early departure from the sinking ship demonstrated selfishness and poor judgment. The competing narratives reflected the deep political divisions that would characterise his later reign. The investigation into the disaster revealed the complex factors that had contributed to the tragedy. While James's navigational dispute with the pilot was clearly significant, other factors, including poor weather conditions, inadequate charts, and the inherent dangers of coastal navigation all played roles. The complexity of causation made it difficult to assign definitive blame for the disaster. James's personal response to the tragedy reflected his developing religious convictions and his belief in divine providence. He interpreted his survival as evidence that God had preserved him for important future service, while the deaths of so many others reinforced his sense of the fragility of human life and the importance of spiritual preparation for eternity. The disaster also strengthened James's relationships with the survivors, who shared a traumatic experience that created lasting bonds of loyalty and mutual obligation. Many of these men would later serve in important positions during James's reign, their shared experience of surviving the Gloucester creating a sense of special intimacy and trust. The psychological impact of the shipwreck on James was profound and lasting. Having faced death so closely, he developed an even stronger sense of his own destiny and divine mission. The experience reinforced his belief that he was preserved by God for important purposes, an attitude that would contribute to his inflexibility and resistance to compromise during his later reign. The wreck of HMS Gloucester thus represented both personal trauma and political transformation for James. The experience had tested his courage, revealed his character, and provided him with a powerful narrative of divine preservation that would influence both his self-perception and his public image. The Duke who survived the shipwreck was more convinced than ever of his destined role in English history, a conviction that would prove both inspiring and ultimately destructive. The early morning hours of February 6, 1685 brought news that would transform James from heir presumptive into King of three kingdoms. Charles II, who had ruled England, Scotland and Ireland for 25 years since the Restoration, died peacefully in his bed at Whitehall Palace after suffering what modern medical experts believe was a stroke. For James, who had waited decades for this moment, the transition from Duke of York to King James II represented both the fulfilment of lifelong expectations and the beginning of his greatest challenge. Charles II's final illness had been brief but dramatic. The king had collapsed while dressing on February 2nd, and despite the efforts of his physicians, his condition deteriorated rapidly over the following days. The court watched with anxiety as the monarch who had navigated so skillfully through the political crises of his reign fought his final battle against mortality. The deathbed conversion of Charles II to Catholicism, performed secretly by Father John Huddleston with James's assistance, provided a dramatic conclusion to a reign that had been marked by religious ambiguity. The king, who had promised religious toleration while maintaining outward conformity to the Church of England, died as a Catholic, vindicating James's religious convictions while creating additional controversy about the dynasty's religious loyalties. James's presence at his brother's deathbed allowed him to witness the peaceful transition of power and to receive Charles's final instructions about governing the kingdoms. The dying king's advice emphasized the importance of maintaining religious tolerance while preserving royal authority, counsel that James would interpret selectively during his own reign. The personal bond between the brothers was evident in Charles's final words, expressing confidence in James's ability to rule effectively. The immediate aftermath of Charles II's death was remarkably peaceful, confounding those who had predicted civil unrest upon James's accession. The military commanders, judicial officials and administrative officers who might have resisted a Catholic king instead took their oaths of allegiance to James II without significant protest. This smooth transition reflected both careful preparation by royal officials and genuine popular acceptance of hereditary succession. The proclamation of James II throughout his kingdoms was accompanied by expressions of loyalty and support that surprised even his supporters. London crowds cheered the new king, church bells rang in celebration, and local officials competed to demonstrate their enthusiasm for the new reign. The contrast with the fears expressed during the exclusion crisis was remarkable and seemed to vindicate those who had argued that religious differences were less important than constitutional stability. James's first public appearance as king, at the meeting of the Privy Council on February 6th, demonstrated both his preparedness for kingship and his awareness of the challenges he faced. His speech to the assembled councillors emphasised continuity with his brother's policies, while promising to maintain the Church of England and respect parliamentary rights. The moderate tone surprised those who had expected more aggressive assertion of Catholic interests. The new king's decision to retain most of Charles II's ministers and advisers reflected both political wisdom and personal caution. James understood that dramatic personnel changes would create unnecessary alarm while disrupting the administrative continuity essential for effective government. The retention of Protestant ministers also demonstrated his commitment to religious balance in his administration. The funeral of Charles II provided James with his first major ceremonial challenge as king. The elaborate state funeral, conducted according to Anglican rites despite the late king's Catholic conversion, required careful management to avoid religious controversy while honouring the deceased monarch appropriately. James's dignified participation in the Anglican ceremonies demonstrated his willingness to respect established traditions even when they conflicted with his personal convictions. The European reaction to James's accession was mixed, but generally favourable. Catholic monarchs welcomed the elevation of a fellow Catholic to one of Europe's most important thrones, while Protestant rulers adopted a wait-and-see attitude toward the new king's policies. The diplomatic community in London reported that James seemed well prepared for kingship and committed to maintaining England's existing international relationships. The financial situation that James inherited from his brother was relatively stable, providing him with resources necessary for effective government. Parliament had granted Charles II generous revenues during his final years, and these grants continued under the new king. The fiscal stability gave James considerable independence from parliamentary pressure and allowed him to pursue his preferred policies without immediate financial constraints. James's coronation, scheduled for April 23, 1685, would provide him with the opportunity to demonstrate his vision for the monarchy while managing the religious sensitivities created by his Catholic faith. The planning for this elaborate ceremony required careful negotiation between traditional Anglican requirements and James's personal religious convictions, balancing act that would characterise much of his reign. The new king's first major political decision involved the composition of his government and the direction of his policies. James's choices would reveal whether he intended to govern as a moderate Catholic willing to work within existing institutions, or as a revolutionary determined to transform English religious and political life. The early signs were encouraging for those who hoped for continuity and moderation. Personal correspondence from this period reveals James's excitement about finally achieving the position he had long expected, while also showing his awareness of the enormous responsibilities he had inherited. Letters to his daughter, Mary, and son-in-law William of Orange emphasised his commitment to family unity and international stability, themes that would become increasingly important as his reign progressed. The transformation from Duke of York to King James II represented more than a change of title. It marked James's emergence as the most powerful Catholic ruler in Protestant Europe and the leader of kingdoms that had been shaped by a century of religious conflict. The success or failure of his reign would determine not only his personal fate, but also the future of Catholic-Protestant relations throughout the British Isles. The king who emerged from the ceremonies of accession was confident in his abilities, supported by his subjects, and committed to policies that he believed would strengthen both royal authority and religious harmony. The tragedy of James II was not that he lacked good intentions or governing ability, but that his understanding of his kingdoms and their people was fatally flawed, leading him to pursue policies that would ultimately destroy everything he hoped to achieve. April 23rd, 1685, dawned bright and clear over London as the city prepared for one of the most controversial coronations in English history. For the first time in over a century, a Catholic would be crowned King of England, Scotland, and Ireland in Westminster Abbey. The elaborate ceremony that unfolded that spring day represented both the fulfilment of James's lifelong expectations and the beginning of a reign that would test the limits of religious tolerance in Protestant Britain. The preparations for James's coronation had required months of careful planning to balance traditional Anglican requirements with the new king's Catholic convictions. The ceremony itself would follow the ancient Anglican rite established centuries earlier, but modifications would be necessary to accommodate a monarch who could not in good conscience participate in Protestant communion or take certain oaths that condemned Catholic doctrine. Westminster Abbey, that ancient seat of English coronations, had been decorated with unprecedented splendour for the occasion. Tapestries, flowers, and royal regalia transformed the Gothic interior into a glittering stage worthy of the momentous ceremony. The congregation included representatives from across Europe, reflecting both the international significance of the event and the curiosity about how a Catholic coronation would be conducted in a Protestant kingdom. James's decision to be crowned according to Anglican tradition, rather than seeking a Catholic ceremony, demonstrated his understanding of constitutional requirements and his desire to reassure Protestant subjects. The compromise satisfied legal necessities, while allowing James to maintain his personal religious integrity through subtle modifications to the traditional service. The procession from Westminster Hall to the Abbey rivaled any royal spectacle in European history. James, dressed in robes of purple velvet trimmed with ermine, rode in a magnificent coach drawn by 8 grey horses through streets lined with cheering crowds. The Duke of Norfolk, as Earl Marshal, orchestrated the elaborate procession that included nobles, clergy, and representatives of the ancient institutions of English government. Queen Mary of Modena, pregnant with what would become the future James Francis Edward Stuart, presented a figure of elegant dignity as she proceeded to her own coronation beside her husband. The sight of a Catholic queen being crowned alongside a Catholic king created powerful symbolism that supporters interpreted as divine favour, while critics saw as a dangerous precedent for future Catholic influence. The coronation ceremony itself was conducted by William Sancroft, Archbishop of Canterbury, who managed the delicate task of crowning a Catholic king according to Protestant rites with remarkable diplomatic skill. Sancroft's participation legitimised the ceremony, while his carefully chosen words and gestures reassured Anglican observers about the Church of England's continued importance. The moment of crowning represented the culmination of James's lifelong journey from exiled prince to reigning monarch. As the ancient crown of St Edward was placed upon his head, James became not only King of England but also the focal point for Catholic hopes throughout Europe and Protestant fears throughout his own kingdoms. The symbolism of the moment would resonate throughout his brief reign. The oath-taking portion of the ceremony required careful modification to accommodate James's religious convictions. While he could not swear to maintain the Protestant religion as established by law, he did promise to govern according to existing laws and customs. This compromise satisfied constitutional requirements while avoiding direct contradiction of his Catholic faith. The anointing with holy oil, the most sacred moment of the coronation ritual, proceeded according to ancient tradition despite James's Catholicism. The ceremony's sacramental character appealed to James's Catholic understanding of kingship as a divinely ordained institution, while its Anglican context reassured Protestant observers about constitutional continuity. The presentation of the regalia, the sceptre, orb, and sword of state, followed traditional patterns that emphasised the king's role as defender of justice, protector of the church, and guardian of the realm. Each item carried symbolic meaning that transcended religious differences while emphasising the universal aspects of royal responsibility. The homage ceremony, in which the great nobles and prelates of the realm knelt before James to swear allegiance, provided visible evidence of the political elite's acceptance of the new king. The participation of prominent Protestant nobles and Anglican bishops demonstrated that religious differences need not prevent political cooperation, at least initially. The coronation banquet in Westminster Hall featured elaborate pageantry and ceremonial dining that celebrated both royal magnificence and constitutional tradition. The champion of England's ritual challenge to any who disputed the king's right to rule went unanswered, symbolically confirming James's legitimate authority over his kingdoms. The popular celebration that followed the coronation throughout London and other major cities suggested genuine enthusiasm for the new reign. Bonfires, bell-ringing and public festivities indicated that ordinary people were willing to accept a Catholic king, provided he governed moderately and respected established traditions. International observers noted the smooth conduct of the ceremony and the apparent acceptance of James by his subjects. Catholic ambassadors reported triumphantly to their home courts about the restoration of Catholic monarchy in England, while Protestant diplomats emphasised the traditional nature of the ceremony and the constitutional limitations on royal power. The coronation also marked Mary of Modena's formal recognition as Queen of England, a position that gave her potentially significant influence over policy and court appointments. Her Italian Catholic background and her connections to European Catholic networks would prove controversial as the reign progressed, but her dignity and grace at the coronation ceremony impressed even hostile observers. The religious significance of the coronation extended far beyond its immediate political implications. For European Catholics, James's coronation represented hope for Catholic restoration throughout Protestant Europe. For English Protestants, it created fears about the long-term direction of religious policy and the possibility of systematic Catholic advancement. The constitutional implications of crowning a Catholic king according to Protestant rites created precedents that would influence future discussions about the relationship between religious belief and political authority. The ceremony demonstrated that religious differences need not prevent effective government, but it also highlighted the tensions that would characterise James's reign. Most importantly, the coronation established James as the legitimate king of his three kingdoms while also creating expectations about his future conduct that would prove impossible to fulfil. The moderation and constitutional respect displayed during the ceremony created hopes for religious harmony that James's subsequent policies would disappoint, contributing to the ultimate failure of his reign. The king who emerged from Westminster Abbey on that April day in 1685 had achieved everything he had worked toward throughout his adult life. He possessed legitimate authority, popular support, and the resources necessary for effective government. The tragedy of James II was that he would interpret this success as a mandate for policies that would ultimately destroy everything the coronation had seemed to promise. Just weeks after his triumphant coronation, James II faced his first serious challenge as king when his nephew, James Scott, Duke of Monmouth, landed in Dorset with a small army and proclaimed himself the rightful King of England. The rebellion that followed would test James's military skills, political judgment, and capacity for mercy, while also revealing the depth of Protestant opposition to Catholic rule that lay beneath the surface of apparent acceptance. Monmouth's decision to launch his rebellion in the summer of 1685 reflected both desperation and miscalculation. The Duke, Charles II's eldest illegitimate son, had been living in exile in the Netherlands since his involvement in the Rye House plot. Despite his illegitimate birth, Monmouth possessed considerable personal charm, Protestant credentials, and military experience that made him an attractive alternative to James for those who could not accept a Catholic king. The timing of Monmouth's invasion was carefully calculated to exploit what he perceived as weakness in James's position. The new king had not yet had time to consolidate his authority or build strong relationships with his subjects. Moreover, the West Country, where Monmouth chose to land, had a strong tradition of Protestant dissent and opposition to royal authority that might provide a sympathetic audience for his cause. Monmouth's landing at Lyme Regis on June 11, 1685, marked the beginning of the last significant armed rebellion against royal authority in English history. The Duke arrived with only 82 followers and limited military supplies, relying on his expectation that English Protestants would flock to his banner once they learned of his arrival. This assumption would prove fatally optimistic. The initial response to Monmouth's landing was mixed but generally disappointing for the rebel cause. While some local dissenters and former Commonwealth soldiers did join his forces, the expected mass uprising failed to materialise. The Protestant gentry, who might have provided crucial leadership and resources, largely remained aloof from the rebellion, preferring to await developments rather than commit themselves to what appeared to be a desperate venture. James's response to news of the rebellion demonstrated both his military competence and his ruthless determination to preserve royal authority. Rather than underestimating the threat or delegating command to subordinates, the king personally took charge of the government's military response, drawing on his extensive experience as a professional soldier and naval commander. The royal army that assembled to suppress Monmouth's rebellion was relatively small but professionally trained and well equipped. James's decision to rely on regular troops rather than local militias reflected his understanding that military effectiveness was more important than popular participation in crushing the revolt. The king's continental military experience had taught him the value of disciplined professional soldiers over enthusiastic but untrained volunteers. John Churchill, the future Duke of Marlborough, played a crucial role in the campaign against Monmouth, demonstrating the military genius that would later make him famous throughout Europe. Churchill's tactical innovations and strategic insights proved invaluable in outmanoeuvring Monmouth's forces and preventing the rebellion from gaining momentum or expanding geographically. The Battle of Sedgemoor, fought on July 6, 1685, marked the climactic engagement of the rebellion and the last pitched battle on English soil. Monmouth's attempt to launch a surprise night attack on the royal army was defeated through a combination of superior discipline, better intelligence, and tactical flexibility. The battle demonstrated the enormous advantages that professional military forces possessed over improvised rebel armies. The defeat at Sedgemoor effectively ended Monmouth's rebellion, though the Duke himself managed to escape the battlefield and attempt to flee the country. His capture 2 days later in a ditch in Hampshire, disguised as a shepherd, provided a pathetic end to a venture that had begun with such ambitious hopes. The contrast between Monmouth's royal pretensions and his ignominious capture highlighted the futility of his cause. James's decision to execute Monmouth despite their family relationship revealed the king's determination to eliminate any potential focus for future opposition. The execution, carried out at Tower Hill on July 15, 1685, was botched by the inexperienced executioner, requiring multiple blows to sever the Duke's head. The gruesome spectacle created sympathy for Monmouth while demonstrating the brutal reality of royal justice. The suppression of Monmouth's rebellion was followed by a judicial campaign of unprecedented severity known as the Bloody Assizes. Lord Chief Justice George Jeffreys, acting on James's explicit instructions, conducted trials throughout the West Country that resulted in over 300 executions and hundreds of sentences of transportation to the Caribbean colonies. The severity of these punishments shocked even contemporary observers accustomed to harsh justice. Geoffrey's conduct during the Bloody Assizes revealed both his personal cruelty and his complete subservience to royal authority. His savage sentences, mocking treatment of defendants, and obvious relish for his work created lasting hostility toward James's government, while demonstrating that the king was willing to use extreme measures to maintain his authority. The transportation sentences imposed on many of Monmouth's followers effectively condemned them to slavery in the Caribbean sugar plantations. The conditions on these plantations were so harsh that transportation was often equivalent to a death sentence, making James's justice even more severe than it initially appeared. The policy revealed the king's willingness to use economic as well as physical punishment to deter future opposition. The international implications of Monmouth's rebellion were significant, as several European governments had been monitoring English political developments with interest. The rebellion's failure demonstrated James's ability to maintain internal order while also revealing the extent of Protestant opposition to his rule. These lessons would influence foreign policy calculations throughout the remainder of his reign. The rebellion also had important consequences for James's relationship with his son-in-law William of Orange, who had been criticised for failing to prevent Monmouth's departure from the Netherlands. While William had not actively supported the rebellion, his passive attitude toward Monmouth's preparations created suspicions about his loyalty to James that would prove prophetic during the Glorious Revolution. The domestic political impact of the Monmouth rebellion was profound and lasting. The king's harsh response to the revolt demonstrated his determination to maintain royal authority through force when necessary, while also revealing his lack of political sensitivity and his inability to distinguish between justice and revenge. These characteristics would prove fatal when he faced more serious opposition later in his reign. The financial cost of suppressing the rebellion and conducting the subsequent trials was enormous, requiring James to seek additional revenue from Parliament and other sources. The expense demonstrated the economic burden that internal disorder imposed on the monarchy, while also creating precedents for royal action that would influence future policy decisions. Most importantly, the Monmouth Rebellion and its aftermath established patterns of royal behaviour that would characterise the remainder of James's reign. His reliance on military force, his trust in ruthless subordinates like Jeffreys, and his willingness to use extreme measures against opposition all emerge from his response to this first challenge to his authority. The king who survived the Monmouth Rebellion was more confident in his power, but also more isolated from his subjects. The brutal suppression of the revolt had eliminated immediate threats to royal authority, while creating deeper currents of opposition that would eventually prove more dangerous than anything Monmouth had represented. The victory had been won, but at a cost that would ultimately prove too high to sustain. With the Monmouth Rebellion crushed and his authority seemingly secure, James II embarked upon the most controversial policy of his reign, a systematic campaign to advance Catholic interest throughout his kingdoms. What began as modest attempts to provide relief for his co-religionists evolved into a comprehensive programme that would ultimately unite virtually all of Protestant England against his rule, and provide the justification for the revolution that would destroy his monarchy. The roots of James's Catholic policy lay in his genuine conviction that the penal laws against Catholics were both unjust and politically counterproductive. Having witnessed the loyalty of Catholic soldiers during the Monmouth Rebellion and the administrative competence of Catholic officials in his service, James believed that ending religious discrimination would strengthen rather than weaken his government. This assessment, while logically defensible, catastrophically underestimated the depth of Protestant opposition to Catholic advancement. James's first major step toward Catholic restoration came with his use of the royal dispensing power to exempt individual Catholics from the religious test required for military and civil office. This prerogative, which had been used sparingly by previous monarchs for specific cases, was now employed systematically to create a parallel Catholic administration that could implement the king's policies without parliamentary interference. The appointment of Catholics to senior military positions caused particular alarm among Protestant observers who remembered the role that military force had played in establishing Catholic absolutism in France. James's promotion of Catholic officers like Richard Talbot in Ireland and the conversion of several Protestant officers to Catholicism suggested a deliberate strategy to create a Catholic military establishment that could enforce religious change throughout the kingdoms. The ecclesiastical dimension of James's Catholic campaign involved the establishment of Catholic chapels, schools, and religious houses that had been prohibited since the Reformation. The king's personal attendance at Catholic Mass in his private chapel was accompanied by increasingly public Catholic ceremonies that suggested official favour for the Catholic Church and corresponding decline in the status of the Church of England. James's appointment of Catholic judges and magistrates represented a direct challenge to the Protestant monopoly on judicial authority that had existed since the reign of Elizabeth I. The elevation of Catholics to positions where they could interpret and enforce English law created fears that legal traditions protecting Protestant interests might be subverted in favour of Catholic doctrine and canon law. The economic aspects of James's Catholic policy involved the redistribution of patronage and royal favour toward Catholic merchants, landowners and professionals who had been excluded from advancement under previous reigns. While this policy provided the king with a loyal constituency, it also created resentment among Protestant interests who had previously enjoyed exclusive access to royal bounty. The educational dimension of the Catholic campaign proved particularly controversial, as James used his authority to place Catholics in prominent positions at Oxford and Cambridge universities. The Magdalen College controversy, in which the king attempted to install a Catholic president against the wishes of the college fellows, became a symbol of royal tyranny and religious persecution that resonated throughout Protestant England. James's establishment of a court of ecclesiastical commission to enforce religious policy created institutional machinery for Catholic advancement while bypassing traditional Anglican authority. The commission's power to suspend and remove Protestant clergy who opposed royal policy represented a direct threat to the independence of the Church of England and the security of its ministers. The international dimensions of James's Catholic policy included the restoration of diplomatic relations with the Papal States and the reception of a papal nuncio in England for the first time since the reign of Mary Tudor. These developments suggested that England was rejoining the Catholic community of European nations while abandoning its traditional role as the leader of Protestant resistance to Catholic power. The propaganda campaign that accompanied James's Catholic policies included the publication of Catholic literature, the establishment of Catholic printing presses, and the public celebration of Catholic holy days and ceremonies. These activities created a sense that Catholicism was experiencing a genuine revival in England, while Protestantism was being systematically undermined by royal policy. James's use of the dispensing power reached its climax with the Declaration of Indulgence of April 1687, which suspended all penal laws against Catholics and Protestant dissenters while granting broad religious toleration throughout the kingdom. While presented as a measure of universal religious liberty, the Declaration was widely seen as a Catholic stratagem designed to divide Protestant opposition while advancing Catholic interests. The political strategy behind the Declaration of Indulgence involved an attempt to create an alliance between Catholics and Protestant dissenters that could provide electoral support for pro-Catholic parliamentary candidates. James's systematic remodelling of borough corporations and election procedures was designed to produce a parliament that would ratify his religious policies and make them permanent through statute. The opposition that James's Catholic campaign generated transcended traditional political divisions, uniting Whigs and Tories, Anglicans and Protestant dissenters in common resistance to what they saw as a fundamental threat to English Protestant identity. This unity of opposition would prove crucial when the final crisis of the reign arrived, and James faced a revolution supported by virtually all elements of Protestant society. The intellectual justification for James's policies rested on his belief that religious toleration and Catholic advancement would ultimately benefit all his subjects by ending the religious conflicts that had plagued England since the Reformation. His continental European perspective convinced him that religious uniformity was less important than political loyalty, a calculation that proved disastrously wrong in the English context. The psychological dimensions of James's Catholic campaign reflected his deep personal conviction that he had been preserved by divine providence to restore the true faith to his ancestral kingdoms. This sense of religious mission made compromise or retreat virtually impossible, as any limitation on Catholic advancement would represent betrayal of his divine calling and abandonment of his co-religionists. The international support that James received from Catholic powers, particularly France, reinforced his conviction that his policies were both morally correct and politically sustainable. The financial and diplomatic backing provided by Louis XIV encouraged James to believe that Catholic Europe would support him against Protestant opposition, a calculation that would prove inadequate when the final test came. Most importantly, James's Catholic campaign created the political and religious conditions that would make the Glorious Revolution not only possible, but necessary in the minds of Protestant England. By systematically challenging Protestant interests and advancing Catholic alternatives, James had convinced his subjects that their religion, liberties, and property were all threatened by his policies. The campaign that was intended to secure Catholic restoration had instead secured Catholic destruction and royal exile. The crisis that would ultimately destroy James II's reign began with a seemingly routine royal proclamation and escalated into a constitutional confrontation that would unite Protestant England against the king's religious policies. The trial of the 7 bishops in the summer of 1688 marked the moment when opposition to James's Catholic campaign moved from private grumbling to open resistance, creating the political conditions that would make revolution both possible and necessary. The immediate cause of the bishops' crisis was James's decision in April 1688 to reissue his Declaration of Indulgence with the additional requirement that it be read from every pulpit in England on 2 successive Sundays. This command placed Anglican clergy in an impossible position, forcing them to choose between obedience to their king and loyalty to their religious convictions. The requirement that Protestant ministers actively promote Catholic interests struck many as a fundamental violation of their pastoral duties. William Sancroft, Archbishop of Canterbury, emerged as the leader of Anglican resistance to the king's command. As the senior prelate of the Church of England, Sancroft possessed both the authority and the obligation to defend his church against what he viewed as royal tyranny. His decision to resist the king's order marked a turning point in the relationship between the monarchy and the established church that had supported royal authority since the Reformation. The petition that Sancroft and 6 other bishops presented to James on May 18, 1688, was carefully crafted to demonstrate respect for royal authority while firmly rejecting the command to read the Declaration of Indulgence. The bishops argued that the declaration was based on an illegal use of the dispensing power, and that requiring clergy to read it would force them to participate in unlawful activity. The petition was both a legal argument and a moral protest. James's reaction to the bishops' petition revealed the paranoia and inflexibility that had come to characterize his approach to political opposition. Rather than seeing the petition as a respectful expression of constitutional concerns, the king interpreted it as seditious libel and treasonable resistance to royal authority. His decision to prosecute the bishops marked a dramatic escalation of the conflict between Crown and Church. The arrest of the 7 bishops on June 8, 1688, created a sensation throughout England and transformed a constitutional dispute into a popular cause. The sight of the nation's most senior religious leaders being escorted to the Tower of London as common criminals shocked Protestant opinion and provided tangible evidence of the king's hostility to the established church. The arrest united Anglican opinion against the king's policies as nothing else could have done. The bishops who joined Sancroft in resistance represented a cross-section of Anglican leadership that included both high churchmen and moderate Protestants. Their unity in opposing the king's command demonstrated that resistance to Catholic policies extended throughout the Church of England, rather than being confined to extremist elements. This broad-based opposition would prove crucial in legitimizing the revolution that followed. The legal arguments surrounding the bishop's case focused on fundamental questions about the extent of royal prerogative and the limits of parliamentary authority. The bishop's lawyers argued that the dispensing power could not be used to suspend laws passed by Parliament, while the Crown's prosecutors maintained that royal prerogative included the right to grant religious toleration. The case thus became a test of competing theories of government and constitutional authority. The popular support that the bishops received during their imprisonment demonstrated the depth of Protestant opposition to James's policies and the extent to which royal authority had been undermined by the Catholic campaign. Crowds gathered outside the Tower to show support for the imprisoned prelates, while prayers for their deliverance were offered in churches throughout England. The bishops had become symbols of Protestant resistance to Catholic tyranny. The trial itself, which began on June 29, 1688, became a public spectacle that attracted attention throughout Europe. The defence's argument that the Declaration of Indulgence was illegal struck at the heart of James's religious policy, while the Crown's case required defending the most controversial aspects of royal prerogative. The proceedings provided a platform for airing constitutional arguments that had been suppressed since the collapse of the exclusion movement. The jury's deliberation on the evening of June 30th created extraordinary tension throughout London, as crowds gathered outside Westminster Hall to await the verdict. The jurors' decision to acquit the bishops of seditious libel was announced to scenes of wild celebration that demonstrated the extent to which public opinion had turned against the king's policies. Church bells rang throughout the capital, and bonfires blazed in celebration of what was seen as a victory for Protestant England. The international implications of the bishop's trial were enormous, as European observers recognised that James's authority had been fundamentally undermined by his failure to secure convictions against the most prominent representatives of the established church. The trial demonstrated that English juries would not support royal policies that were seen as threats to Protestant religion and constitutional government. The acquittal of the 7 bishops marked the effective end of James's ability to govern through intimidation and legal persecution. The failure to secure convictions against such prominent defendants revealed the limitations of royal authority and encouraged further resistance to Catholic policies. The king, who had hoped to use the legal system to enforce religious change, had instead provided his opponents with a platform for constitutional opposition. The political consequences of the bishop's trial extended far beyond the immediate legal issues involved. The case had established the principle that royal prerogative was subject to legal limitations, and that Parliament's authority could not be suspended by royal decree. These precedents would prove crucial during the constitutional settlement that followed the Glorious Revolution. Most importantly, the trial of the 7 bishops provided the immediate catalyst for the Glorious Revolution by demonstrating that James's policies had united virtually all of Protestant England in opposition to his rule. The bishops' acquittal was celebrated as a national victory, while their prosecution had revealed the king's determination to use any means necessary to advance Catholic interests. The trial had made revolution not only possible but necessary for the preservation of Protestant England. The 7 prelates who had risked imprisonment and possible execution for their religious convictions had achieved something that years of parliamentary opposition had failed to accomplish. They had exposed the fundamental incompatibility between James's Catholic policies and English Protestant traditions. Their courage in facing royal persecution had provided Protestant England with the martyrs it needed to justify revolution, while their acquittal had demonstrated that even the king's own legal system would not support his religious campaign. On the morning of June 10th, 1688, as the 7 bishops awaited trial in the Tower of London, Queen Mary of Modena gave birth to a son at St James's Palace. The arrival of James Francis Edward Stuart should have been a moment of celebration for the royal family, representing as it did the continuation of the Stuart dynasty and the heir that James had long desired. Instead, the birth became the catalyst for the revolution that would destroy James's reign and forever alter the course of British history. The pregnancy itself had been closely watched throughout Protestant England with a mixture of hope and dread. Many had privately wished that the Queen would fail to produce a surviving male heir, as this would ensure that the crown would eventually pass to James's Protestant daughters, Mary and Anne. The possibility of a Catholic dynasty extending beyond James's own reign had been the nightmare scenario that had motivated much of the opposition to his policies. The circumstances surrounding the birth were immediately controversial, as the Queen had experienced multiple miscarriages during her 15-year marriage to James, leading some to question whether she was capable of carrying a child to term. When she announced her pregnancy in late 1687, skeptics suggested that the announcement was politically motivated, designed to strengthen James's position during the growing crisis over his Catholic policies. The birth itself took place in the traditional manner of royal confinements, with numerous witnesses present to verify the legitimacy of the heir. However, the witnesses were predominantly Catholic, leading Protestant critics to question their reliability and to suggest that their testimony could not be trusted. The absence of prominent Protestant nobles and Anglican bishops from the birthing chamber created suspicions that would plague the new prince throughout his life. Within hours of the birth, rumours began circulating that the infant was not the Queen's natural child, but rather a substitute smuggled into the royal bedchamber in a warming pan. This fantastic conspiracy theory, while completely unfounded, gained credence among Protestants desperate to deny the reality of a Catholic heir. The warming pan baby story became one of the most persistent myths in English political history. James's response to these rumours revealed both his genuine outrage at the impugning of his wife's honour and his political naivety in dealing with popular suspicions. Rather than ignoring the allegations as beneath royal notice, the king published detailed testimonies from midwives and witnesses in an attempt to prove his son's legitimacy. This response, while understandable, gave credibility to the rumours by suggesting that they required formal refutation. The political implications of the prince's birth were immediately apparent to observers throughout Europe. The prospect of a Catholic succession extending beyond James's own lifetime transformed the religious crisis from a temporary inconvenience into a permanent threat to Protestant England. What had been tolerable as a brief aberration became intolerable as a dynastic reality. The international reaction to the birth reflected the broader European struggle between Catholic and Protestant powers. Catholic courts celebrated the arrival of a Catholic heir to one of Europe's most important thrones, while Protestant governments watched with concern as the balance of religious power shifted in favour of their rivals. The birth had European as well as domestic implications. The constitutional questions raised by the prince's birth were complex and unprecedented. Under normal circumstances, the infant would automatically become heir to the throne, displacing his half-sisters Mary and Anne in the line of succession. However, the persistent rumours about his legitimacy created uncertainty about his legal status and his right to inherit the crown. The timing of the birth, coming just as the 7 bishops faced trial for opposing James's religious policies, created a perfect storm of Protestant opposition. The coincidence suggested to many that divine providence was testing English Protestantism, presenting the most serious challenge to their faith and liberties since the reign of Mary Tudor. The birth had transformed a political crisis into a religious crusade. William of Orange's reaction to news of his brother-in-law's birth was carefully measured but privately decisive. As the husband of James's elder daughter Mary, William had previously been second in line to the English throne after his wife. The birth of a male heir had displaced both William and Mary in the succession, eliminating their prospects of ever ruling England unless dramatic action was taken. The propaganda war that erupted following the prince's birth demonstrated the power of conspiracy theories to shape political opinion. Despite the complete absence of credible evidence supporting the warming pan story, the tale spread rapidly throughout Protestant England, becoming accepted truth among those predisposed to believe the worst about James's policies. The birth had provided opponents with a powerful weapon against royal authority. The domestic political impact of the prince's birth was to unite virtually all elements of Protestant society in opposition to James's rule. Moderate Protestants who had been willing to tolerate a Catholic king during his lifetime could not accept the prospect of indefinite Catholic rule. The birth had made revolution not only possible, but necessary for the preservation of Protestant England. The religious implications of the birth extended beyond immediate political concerns to questions about divine providence and the future of Christianity in England. Many Protestants interpreted the crisis as a test of their faith, requiring them to choose between passive obedience to royal authority and active resistance to preserve true religion. The birth had transformed political opposition into religious obligation. The personal impact on James of the suspicion surrounding his son's birth was profound and lasting. The king who should have been celebrating the continuation of his dynasty instead found himself defending his wife's honour and his son's legitimacy against fantastic allegations. The experience confirmed his belief that English Protestantism was fundamentally hostile to Catholic interests and incapable of accepting Catholic rule. Most importantly, the birth of James Francis Edward Stuart provided the immediate catalyst for the Glorious Revolution by convincing Protestant leaders that immediate action was necessary to prevent the establishment of a permanent Catholic dynasty. The infant prince, innocent of any wrongdoing, had become the symbol of everything that Protestant England feared about Catholic rule. His birth had made revolution inevitable. The child whose arrival should have secured the Stuart dynasty had instead ensured its destruction. The warming pan baby story, regardless of its complete falsity, had provided Protestant England with the justification it needed to reject royal authority and seek alternative arrangements. The birth that was meant to guarantee Catholic restoration had instead guaranteed Catholic exile and the triumph of parliamentary government over divine right monarchy. In the wake of the 7 bishops' acquittal and the birth of a Catholic heir to the English throne, a group of prominent Protestant politicians took the extraordinary step of inviting a foreign prince to invade their country. The invitation to William, as it came to be known, represented both the culmination of English Protestant resistance to James's policies and the beginning of the most successful invasion of England since the Norman conquest. The 7 men who signed the invitation represented a careful cross-section of English political and religious leadership, designed to demonstrate broad-based opposition to James's rule. The signatories included both Whigs and Tories, reflecting the extent to which James's Catholic policies had united previously antagonistic political factions in common resistance to royal authority. Henry Sidney, Earl of Romney, emerged as the principal organiser of the invitation, using his diplomatic connections and political experience to coordinate resistance activities. Sidney's role reflected his long-standing opposition to Catholic influence and his conviction that only foreign intervention could preserve Protestant England from Catholic domination. His willingness to commit treason demonstrated the desperation that had seized Protestant leaders. Edward Russell, later Earl of Orford, provided crucial naval expertise and connections that would prove invaluable during William's invasion. Russell's participation ensured that William would receive detailed intelligence about English coastal defences and naval dispositions, while his influence with naval officers would facilitate the defection of key ships when the crisis came. The Bishop of London, Henry Compton, was the only clergyman among the 7 signatories, but his participation was crucial in providing religious legitimacy for what was essentially a treasonable conspiracy. Compton had been suspended from his episcopal functions by James's ecclesiastical commission, making him a symbol of Anglican resistance to royal religious policies. The invitation itself was carefully crafted to provide William with legal and moral justification for invasion while promising him sufficient support to ensure success. The document claimed that 19 out of 20 Englishmen desired a change of government and would support William's intervention. While this estimate was probably optimistic, it reflected genuine Protestant opposition to James's policies. The delivery of the invitation to William at The Hague was managed with considerable secrecy and diplomatic skill. The document was carried by Arthur Herbert, a former naval commander who'd been dismissed by James for refusing to support Catholic policies. Herbert's journey, disguised as an ordinary sailor, demonstrated the lengths to which the conspirators were willing to go to communicate with William. William's response to the invitation reflected both his personal ambitions and his strategic concerns about European politics. As ruler of the Dutch Republic, William was primarily concerned with preventing English support for French expansion in Europe. The invitation provided him with an opportunity to secure English resources for his ongoing struggle against Louis XIV, while potentially gaining significant personal advancement. The strategic situation in Europe during the summer of 1688 was crucial in making William's invasion possible. Louis XIV was distracted by military campaigns in Germany and had withdrawn support from James in favour of pursuing continental objectives. This French distraction eliminated the most serious threat to William's invasion plans and reduced the likelihood of effective foreign support for James. The domestic preparations for William's invasion involved careful coordination between the invited conspirators and their supporters throughout England. Secret communications networks were established to ensure that key military installations and political centres would be secured when William landed. The conspiracy demonstrated remarkable organisational ability and extensive popular support. The propaganda campaign that accompanied the invitation portrayed William not as a foreign invader, but as a liberator coming to restore English liberties and Protestant religion. This narrative was crucial in legitimising what was essentially a foreign conquest, while appealing to English patriotic sentiment. The invasion was presented as a rescue mission rather than a hostile takeover. The military preparations for the invasion required enormous resources and careful planning. William assembled a fleet of over 400 ships, carrying approximately 15,000 troops, making it one of the largest invasion forces in European history. The scale of the preparation demonstrated both William's commitment to success and his assessment of the resistance he expected to encounter. The financial backing for William's invasion came from a variety of sources, including Dutch merchants who hoped to benefit from closer Anglo-Dutch cooperation and international Protestant networks that supported the cause of religious liberty. The financing demonstrated the international character of the opposition to James's policies and the extent of Protestant solidarity across European boundaries. The timing of the invasion was carefully calculated to exploit both seasonal weather patterns and political developments in England. William waited until autumn to launch his fleet, gambling that favourable winds would carry him to England before James could organise effective resistance. The timing proved crucial to his success. The international implications of the invitation were enormous, as it represented an unprecedented example of a nation's political elite formally requesting foreign invasion to change their government. The precedent would influence European politics for generations, while demonstrating the power of religious and ideological motivations to override traditional concepts of national loyalty. The legal and constitutional questions raised by the invitation were complex and would influence English political thought for centuries. The conspirators argued that they were acting to preserve fundamental English liberties against tyrannical government, while their critics maintained that they were committing treason regardless of their motivations. The debate would continue long after the revolution succeeded. Most importantly, the invitation to William represented the point of no return in English Protestant resistance to James's policies. By formally requesting foreign invasion, the conspirators had committed themselves to revolution and made compromise with James impossible. The invitation had transformed scattered opposition into organised rebellion and made the glorious revolution inevitable. The 7 men who signed their names to the invitation had taken the most dangerous step possible in 17th century politics, risking their lives, fortunes and honour in an attempt to preserve what they saw as fundamental English values. Their courage in the face of enormous personal risk would be vindicated by success, but the precedent they established would complicate English constitutional development for generations to come. The autumn of 1688 brought with it weather patterns that would change the course of English history. For weeks, adverse winds had trapped William of Orange's invasion fleet in Dutch ports, leading some to believe that divine providence was protecting James II from foreign invasion. Catholics throughout Europe offered prayers for the continuation of these popish winds that seemed to shield the last Catholic king from his Protestant enemies. But on November 1st, the wind shifted direction, becoming what Protestant propagandists would celebrate as the Protestant wind that carried liberation to England. William's invasion fleet represented one of the most impressive military enterprises of the 17th century. Over 400 vessels of various sizes carried approximately 21,000 soldiers and sailors, along with horses, artillery, and supplies sufficient for an extended campaign. The armada was larger than the Spanish fleet that had attempted to conquer England a century earlier, reflecting both the scale of William's ambitions and the resources of the Dutch Republic. The composition of William's invasion force was carefully calculated to maximise both military effectiveness and political appeal. The core of the army consisted of experienced Dutch and German professional soldiers, but William also included substantial numbers of English and Scottish exiles who could provide local knowledge and serve as symbols of domestic support for his cause. The naval escort that protected William's transports included some of the most modern warships in European waters. Dutch naval technology had advanced considerably since the Anglo-Dutch Wars of the 1660s and 1670s, and William's fleet represented the cutting edge of maritime military capability. The sight of this armada would have impressed potential supporters while intimidating James's forces. The decision to launch the invasion in November represented a significant gamble with weather and seasonal conditions. Autumn storms in the English Channel were notoriously dangerous, and many experienced mariners questioned the wisdom of attempting such a large-scale crossing so late in the year. William's decision to proceed despite these risks demonstrated both his desperation and his confidence in Dutch seamanship. The favourable wind that began on November 1st carried William's fleet out of Dutch harbours and toward the English coast with remarkable speed. The same easterly wind that propelled the invasion fleet prevented James's navy from leaving the Thames estuary to intercept the Dutch ships. This meteorological coincidence was interpreted by both sides as evidence of divine intervention in English affairs. The English defensive preparations had been based on the assumption that any invasion would be directed toward the eastern coast, where the shortest channel crossing would minimise exposure to English naval intervention. James's fleet was positioned near Chatham and the Downs, ready to intercept Dutch ships attempting to land in Kent or Essex. William's decision to sail westward toward Devon caught the English navy out of position. The sight of William's armada passing through the English Channel created a sensation among observers on both sides of the water. The fleet sailed in formal battle order, with flags flying and guns visible, creating an impressive display of military power. English coastal observers were struck by the size and organisation of the invasion force, while Dutch sailors were impressed by their first sight of the English coastline. James's naval commanders faced an impossible situation as they watched William's fleet sail past their positions. The easterly wind that was carrying the Dutch toward Devon also prevented English ships from leaving their anchorages to give pursuit. Admiral Dartmouth, commanding the English fleet, could only watch in frustration as the invasion proceeded without interference. The landing at Torbay on November 5th was executed with remarkable precision and minimal opposition. William had chosen his landing site carefully, selecting a harbour that could accommodate his large fleet while being far enough from London to provide time for political organisation. The date, anniversary of the gunpowder plot, provided additional symbolic significance that Protestant propagandists would exploit effectively. The initial reception that William received in Devon was cautious but not hostile. Local officials were uncertain about how to respond to the invasion, while ordinary citizens were curious about the foreign prince who claimed to be liberating them from tyranny. The absence of immediate resistance encouraged William while demonstrating the limited popular enthusiasm for James's government. William's first proclamation upon landing carefully avoided any claim to the English throne, instead declaring his intention to secure a free and lawful parliament that could address the nation's grievances. This moderate language was designed to reassure English opinion while providing legal cover for what was essentially a foreign conquest. The proclamation demonstrated William's sophisticated understanding of English political sensibilities. The military organisation of William's invasion force reflected lessons learned from decades of European warfare. The army was divided into disciplined regiments with clear command structures and adequate supply arrangements. Unlike many 17th century armies, William's forces were well equipped, regularly paid, and subject to strict discipline that minimised conflict with civilian populations. The propaganda campaign that accompanied the invasion was as carefully planned as the military operation itself. William's supporters had prepared thousands of copies of his declaration explaining his motives and objectives, while also organising networks of sympathisers who could spread favourable information about his cause. The invasion succeeded as much through political as military means. The response of English naval officers to William's successful landing revealed the extent to which James had lost the loyalty of his military commanders. Many captains, while not actively supporting the invasion, declined to take aggressive action against William's fleet. This passive resistance proved crucial in allowing the Dutch to establish secure communications with their homeland. The weather that had enabled William's invasion continued to favour his cause throughout the early days of the campaign. Clear skies and moderate temperatures facilitated military operations, while allowing for the political communications that were essential to building support for the revolutionary cause. The Protestant wind had become a Protestant season that seemed to bless William's enterprise. International observers recognised that William's successful landing marked a turning point in European politics as well as English affairs. The invasion demonstrated that even established monarchies could be overthrown through foreign intervention, supported by domestic opposition. The precedent would influence revolutionary movements throughout Europe for generations to come. The religious symbolism attached to the favourable weather was exploited by both Protestant and Catholic propagandists to support their respective interpretations of events. Protestants saw the Protestant wind as evidence of divine approval for William's cause, while Catholics argued that God was testing their faith through temporary adversity. The meteorological became theological in the heated atmosphere of 1688. Most importantly, the wind that carried William to England had made the Glorious Revolution possible by enabling the largest and most successful invasion in English history since 1066. Without the favourable weather conditions that trapped James's fleet and propelled William's armada, the invasion might have failed, and English history would have developed along very different lines. The Protestant wind had blown away the last Catholic king of England and ushered in a new era of constitutional monarchy and parliamentary supremacy. The weeks following William's successful landing at Torbay witnessed one of the most remarkable collapses of royal authority in English history. James II, who had seemed secure on his throne just months earlier, found his support melting away with astonishing speed as military commanders, political allies, church leaders, and even family members abandoned his cause in favour of the Dutch invader. James's initial response to William's invasion revealed both his military competence and his fatal political weaknesses. The king assembled a substantial army at Salisbury, demonstrating his continued ability to command resources and organise resistance. However, his failure to understand the political dimensions of the crisis would prove more damaging than any military defeat. The royal army that gathered at Salisbury in November 1688 represented the last significant force loyal to James's government. Approximately 25,000 troops assembled under the king's personal command, including both English regiments and Irish Catholic soldiers whom James trusted more than his Protestant subjects. The force was numerically superior to William's invasion army, and should have been capable of defeating the Dutch in open battle. However, the morale and loyalty of James's army were fatally compromised by the political crisis that had preceded William's invasion. Many officers questioned the wisdom of fighting to preserve Catholic rule in Protestant England, while others calculated that their futures lay with William rather than James. The religious and political divisions that had weakened James's government now infected his military forces. The first major defection came from John Churchill, later Duke of Marlborough, whose decision to join William represented both personal betrayal and political calculation. Churchill had served James faithfully for years, rising to high rank through royal favour, but he recognised that the king's policies were leading toward disaster. His defection to William was a devastating blow to James's confidence and military effectiveness. Churchill's abandonment of James was followed by a cascade of military defections that effectively destroyed the royal army's capacity for resistance. Officers who had sworn loyalty to the king now declared for William, taking their regiments with them or rendering them useless through divided loyalties. The army that should have defended James instead became a source of weakness and uncertainty. The political defections were equally damaging to James's cause. Lord Cornbury, the king's own nephew, declared for William while commanding cavalry at Salisbury, demonstrating that even family loyalty could not overcome religious and political opposition to James's policies. The defection suggested that the king had lost the support of the next generation of the royal family. Princess Anne's decision to abandon her father represented the most personally devastating betrayal that James experienced during the crisis. Anne's letter declaring her support for William's intervention was a public repudiation of filial duty that shocked contemporary observers and confirmed that even James's own children could not support his policies. The princess had chosen religious conviction over family loyalty. The collapse of civilian administration accompanied the military breakdown, as local officials throughout England declared their support for William or simply ceased to function effectively. The machinery of government that had served James during the early years of his reign now worked against him, as administrators calculated that their futures lay with the new regime. The Church of England's response to the crisis was overwhelmingly supportive of William's intervention, with clergy throughout the country offering prayers for the success of the Protestant liberator, while refusing to pray for James's victory. The religious establishment that James had tried to subordinate to royal authority now openly supported his enemies. James's personal response to these defections revealed the psychological toll that the crisis was taking on the king. Contemporary accounts describe him as suffering from severe nosebleeds, insomnia, and periods of apparent confusion that suggested he was experiencing a nervous breakdown. The strain of seeing his life's work destroyed by those he had trusted was overwhelming. The international isolation that accompanied James's domestic political collapse further weakened his position. Louis XIV, distracted by his own military campaigns in Germany, provided only token support for his fellow Catholic monarch. The failure of French assistance to materialise effectively doomed any hope of successful resistance to William's invasion. The speed of James's political collapse surprised even William's supporters, who had expected a longer and more difficult campaign to secure control of England. The Dutch prince's careful political preparation and the depth of English opposition to James's policies had created conditions for rapid success that exceeded the most optimistic expectations. The economic dimensions of the collapse included the flight of capital from England as investors sought to protect their assets from the uncertainty of civil war. The financial markets that had supported James's government now worked against him as merchants and bankers hedged their bets by supporting William's cause. James's decision to send his wife and infant son to France for safety marked his recognition that the situation had become hopeless. The departure of the Queen and heir apparent was interpreted throughout England as evidence that James himself planned to flee, further undermining what remained of his political support. The attempted flight on December 11th represented James's final acknowledgement that his reign was finished. His decision to throw the Great Seal into the Thames before departing was intended to prevent the legal machinery of government from functioning under William's control, but it served mainly to confirm his abandonment of his responsibilities as king. The capture and return of James to London created an embarrassing anticlimax to what should have been a dramatic royal escape. The former king's forced reappearance in his capital demonstrated his complete helplessness, while creating awkward questions about his future status. William's decision to allow James to escape on a second attempt resolved these difficulties while avoiding the complications that would have followed from holding a former king prisoner. Most importantly, the collapse of James's authority established the precedent that royal power in England was conditional upon popular and parliamentary support, rather than divine right or hereditary succession. The ease with which James's government had been overthrown demonstrated that even legitimate monarchs could not rule effectively without the consent of their subjects. The king, who had seemed so secure on his throne in 1685, had been abandoned by virtually everyone whose support was necessary for effective government. The collapse was so complete and so rapid that it suggested James's regime had never possessed the deep roots necessary for long-term survival. The revolution had succeeded not through military conquest but through political isolation, leaving James as a king without subjects in a kingdom that no longer acknowledged his authority. The transformation of England from Catholic absolutism to Protestant constitutional monarchy occurred with remarkably little violence, earning the events of 1688 to 1689 the title of the Glorious Revolution. This bloodless character was no accident, but rather the result of careful political management by William of Orange and the thorough political preparation that had preceded his invasion. William's strategy from the moment of his landing had been to avoid military confrontation whenever possible, recognising that political victory would be more valuable and more permanent than conquest through force of arms. His declaration that he came not as a conqueror but as a liberator was designed to encourage defections from James's cause while minimising resistance to his own advance. The political sophistication that William demonstrated throughout the Revolution reflected his extensive experience in European diplomacy and his understanding of English constitutional traditions. Unlike foreign invaders who impose their will through military force, William presented himself as the defender of English liberties and Protestant religion, themes that resonated powerfully with his target audience. The careful timing of William's advance on London allowed political pressure to build gradually rather than forcing immediate military confrontation. By proceeding slowly and allowing news of his success to spread throughout the kingdom, William encouraged a steady stream of defections from James's cause while demonstrating his growing strength to potential supporters. The absence of significant popular resistance to William's invasion reflected the extent to which James had alienated his subjects through his Catholic policies. Rather than rallying to defend their king against foreign invasion, most English people either actively supported William or remained neutral in the conflict. This passive acceptance was crucial to the Revolution's bloodless character. The role of political negotiation in securing William's success cannot be overstated. Throughout the crisis, informal communications continued between representatives of both sides, exploring possibilities for compromise while ensuring that transitions of authority occurred as smoothly as possible. These negotiations prevented the kind of violent confrontations that might have characterized a purely military conquest. The international dimensions of the Glorious Revolution also contributed to its peaceful character. European powers, recognizing that William's success was likely, generally accepted the change of government in England rather than supporting James's attempts to regain his throne. This international acquiescence reduced the likelihood of foreign intervention that might have prolonged the conflict. The religious motivations that drove the revolution were presented in terms of liberation and restoration rather than conquest and persecution. William's supporters portrayed the events as a return to England's natural Protestant condition, rather than a revolutionary change, making the transformation seem less threatening to those who might have resisted more radical alterations. The constitutional fiction that James had abdicated his throne by fleeing to France provided a legal framework for the transition that satisfied English respect for law and precedent. Rather than formally deposing a reigning monarch, Parliament could claim to be filling a vacancy created by royal abandonment, a formula that preserved constitutional proprieties while achieving revolutionary results. The decision to offer the crown jointly to William and Mary further reduced potential opposition by maintaining the appearance of dynastic continuity. Mary's claim as James's daughter provided hereditary legitimacy for the new regime, while William's military success provided practical authority. The compromise satisfied both traditional and revolutionary elements. The Bill of Rights that Parliament presented to William and Mary as a condition of their acceptance of the crown established the constitutional framework that would govern English politics for centuries to come. The document's emphasis on parliamentary supremacy, individual rights, and religious liberty reflected the revolutionary character of the settlement while maintaining the forms of traditional monarchy. The speed with which the new government was recognised throughout England, Scotland and Ireland demonstrated the thoroughness of James's political collapse and the effectiveness of William's political strategy. Local officials, military commanders and religious leaders quickly transferred their allegiance to the new regime, creating an appearance of national unity that masked the revolutionary nature of the changes. The economic continuity that characterised the transition helped ensure its peaceful character. Trade, commerce, and financial markets continued to function normally throughout the crisis, minimising the disruption that might have created popular opposition to the new government. The revolution's conservative character in economic matters helped secure middle-class support. The treatment of James's supporters after the Revolution was generally moderate, reflecting William's understanding that magnanimity would be more effective than persecution in securing long-term stability. While some of James's closest advisers faced prosecution or exile, the majority of his supporters were allowed to retain their property and positions provided they accepted the new government. The role of divine providence in explaining the revolution's success became an important theme in contemporary propaganda and later historical interpretation. The favourable weather that had enabled William's invasion, the bloodless character of the political transition, and the speed of James's collapse were all interpreted as evidence of God's favour for the Protestant cause. The international implications of the Glorious Revolution extended far beyond English domestic politics. The successful overthrow of an established monarch through foreign intervention, supported by domestic opposition, provided a model that would influence revolutionary movements throughout Europe. The precedent established in England would inspire later democratic revolutions while demonstrating the power of political organisation and international cooperation. Most importantly, the bloodless character of the Glorious Revolution established the principle that political change in England should be achieved through legal and constitutional means, rather than violence and coercion. This precedent would influence English political development for centuries, creating expectations of peaceful transitions and constitutional government that would distinguish English politics from the more violent patterns common elsewhere in Europe. The revolution that overthrew James II had succeeded not through military conquest but through political isolation, demonstrating that effective government required popular consent rather than merely traditional authority. The bloodless transformation of 1688 had established principles of constitutional monarchy, parliamentary supremacy, and religious liberty that would define English government for generations to come. The ship that carried James II from Rochester to France on December 23, 1688, bore not just a deposed monarch but the last representative of an ancient tradition of divine right monarchy that had governed England for centuries. As the English coastline faded behind him, James entered an exile that would last for the remaining 13 years of his life, providing him with ample time to reflect on the causes of his downfall and the meaning of his brief but transformative reign. The court of Louis XIV at Versailles received James with the courtesy due to a fellow monarch, but the French king's support was motivated more by diplomatic calculation than personal sympathy. Louis saw James as a potential instrument for destabilising William's government and diverting English resources from the broader European conflict, but he was not prepared to make the massive commitment necessary to restore the Stuart monarchy by force. The chateau of Saint-Germain-en-Laye, which Louis provided as James's residence, had historical associations that must have seemed both appropriate and ironic to the exiled king. The palace had once housed another royal exile, James's grandmother Marie de Médicis, providing a reminder that political fortune was cyclical and that royal authority was more fragile than it appeared. The community of English and Irish exiles that gathered around James at Saint-Germain created a shadow court that maintained many of the forms and ceremonies of monarchy, while possessing none of its substance. The elaborate etiquette, formal audiences, and ceremonial occasions that characterised exile life provided comfort to displaced courtiers while highlighting their isolation from real political power. James's personal response to exile revealed both admirable resilience and troubling inflexibility. Rather than accepting responsibility for the policies that had cost him his throne, James interpreted his downfall as divine punishment for his personal sins, particularly his adultery during his first marriage. This religious interpretation of political failure prevented him from learning the lessons that might have enabled restoration. The religious intensity that characterised James's exile years reflected his belief that his sufferings were part of divine providence's plan for his spiritual development. He engaged in extensive religious devotions, consulted frequently with Catholic priests, and composed spiritual meditations that revealed genuine piety alongside political delusion. His faith provided comfort, but also reinforced the attitudes that had caused his downfall. The international dimensions of James's exile were complicated by the outbreak of the War of the League of Augsburg, which pitted France against a coalition including England, the Dutch Republic, and the Holy Roman Empire. James found himself in the awkward position of depending on French support while hoping for English defeat, a contradiction that limited his political effectiveness and moral authority. The Irish dimension of James's exile was particularly significant, as Ireland remained the one part of his former kingdoms where Catholic loyalty to the Stuart cause remained strong. The Jacobite Parliament that met in Dublin in 1689 declared James to be the rightful king and passed legislation reversing the Protestant land settlement, providing him with a legal basis for claiming continued authority. James's decision to travel to Ireland in March 1689 represented his most serious attempt to regain his throne through military action. Accompanied by French troops and supplies, he hoped to use Ireland as a base for reconquering England and Scotland. The campaign that followed would test both his military abilities and his political judgment under the pressure of actual warfare. The Battle of the Boyne on July 1st, 1690, marked the decisive moment of James's attempt to regain his throne through Irish support. His defeat by William's forces demonstrated that military victory was insufficient to restore royal authority without broader political support. More damagingly, James's departure from the battlefield before the fighting was concluded created lasting questions about his personal courage and commitment to his supporters. The aftermath of the Boyne campaign saw James return to France with his reputation severely damaged and his prospects for restoration greatly diminished. His Irish supporters, who had risked everything for his cause, were left to face William's forces alone, creating lasting resentment about royal abandonment that would influence Irish attitudes toward the Stuart cause for generations. The later years of James's exile were marked by increasing religious devotion and political irrelevance. The Treaty of Ryswick in 1697, which ended the War of the League of Augsburg, included French recognition of William as the legitimate King of England, effectively ending Louis XIV's support for Jacobite restoration efforts. James found himself a king without allies in a world that had moved beyond his claims. The personal costs of exile were enormous for James and his family. Separated from his elder daughters and his former kingdoms, he watched helplessly as the political and religious settlement he had tried to reverse became more firmly established. The Catholic restoration that had seemed so promising in 1685 was now impossible, and the Stuart dynasty appeared doomed to permanent exile. The intellectual legacy of James's exile years included his spiritual writings and political reflections, which revealed both the sincerity of his religious convictions and the limitations of his political understanding. His advice to his son emphasized the importance of maintaining Catholic faith, regardless of political consequences, counsel that would influence Jacobite politics for decades to come. The death of James II on September 16th, 1701, at Saint-Germain-en-Laye marked the end of an era in English history. The king who had attempted to restore Catholic monarchy to Protestant England died in exile, his body eventually desecrated during the French Revolution, his political legacy reduced to a cautionary tale about the dangers of religious extremism and political inflexibility. The tragedy of James II was not that he lacked ability or good intentions, but that he fundamentally misunderstood the nature of political authority in late 17th century England. His belief in divine right monarchy and religious uniformity belonged to an earlier age, and his inability to adapt to changing circumstances ultimately destroyed both his reign and his dynasty's prospects for continued rule. The exiled king, who spent his final years in prayer and reflection, had learned the spiritual lessons that suffering could teach, but he never grasped the political lessons that might have prevented his downfall. His story remained a powerful reminder that good intentions and sincere faith were insufficient substitutes for political wisdom and popular support in the complex world of early modern monarchy. As we reach the end of our gentle journey through the life and reign of James II, we find ourselves contemplating one of history's most dramatic examples of how personal conviction and political reality can collide with devastating consequences. The man who began life as a spare heir to the throne, survived civil war and exile, served his country with distinction as a military commander, and finally achieved his lifelong ambition of kingship would ultimately be remembered not for his achievements, but for his failures. James's story serves as a powerful reminder of the complexities of leadership in times of religious and political transition. His genuine desire to create a more tolerant society where Catholics could participate fully in English life was admirable in its intentions, yet catastrophic in its execution. The very policies that he believed would strengthen his kingdom instead united virtually all elements of society against his rule. The religious dimensions of James's downfall cannot be separated from the political and constitutional issues that his reign raised. His conversion to Catholicism was sincere and deeply held, providing him with spiritual comfort and moral certainty that sustained him through years of opposition and eventual exile. However, his inability to understand how his faith appeared to his Protestant subjects proved fatal to his political prospects. The international context of James's reign was equally important in shaping his fate. His policies were implemented at a time when Protestant England was already nervous about Catholic power in Europe, particularly the aggressive expansion of Louis XIV's France. James's association with international Catholicism made him appear to be an agent of foreign interests rather than a patriotic English king, a perception that proved impossible to overcome. The constitutional legacy of James's brief reign was profound and lasting. The glorious revolution that overthrew him established principles of parliamentary supremacy, religious liberty, and constitutional monarchy that would define English government for centuries to come. Ironically, the king who sought to strengthen royal authority ended up destroying the very foundations of divine right monarchy in England. The personal tragedy of James II extended beyond his political failures to encompass the human cost of his choices. His separation from his elder daughters, his exile from the kingdoms he loved, and his ultimate death in a foreign land were the price he paid for his unwillingness to compromise his religious convictions. His story demonstrates both the nobility and the danger of placing principle above pragmatism in political life. The military aspects of James's career, from his continental service in his youth to his final campaign in Ireland, revealed genuine ability and personal courage that contrasted sharply with his political incompetence. His contributions to English naval development and his effective administration in Scotland showed that he possessed many of the qualities necessary for successful leadership, making his ultimate failure all the more poignant. The speed and completeness of James's political collapse in 1688 demonstrated how thoroughly he had misread the mood of his subjects and the nature of English political culture. The king who had seemed secure on his throne just months earlier found himself abandoned by his military commanders, his political allies, and even his own family, suggesting that his policies had created opposition that extended far beyond partisan political differences. The bloodless character of the revolution that overthrew James reflected both William of Orange's political skill and the extent to which James had isolated himself from his subjects. The absence of significant violence during the transition of power suggested that the vast majority of English people preferred constitutional change to continued Catholic rule, a preference that James had consistently underestimated. The international implications of James's downfall extended far beyond English domestic politics. The successful overthrow of a legitimate monarch through foreign intervention, supported by domestic opposition, established precedents that would influence European politics for generations. The Glorious Revolution demonstrated that religious and ideological motivations could override traditional concepts of dynastic loyalty and national sovereignty. The exile years that followed James's deposition revealed both his spiritual growth and his continued political blindness. His increasing religious devotion provided personal comfort, while his refusal to acknowledge the legitimacy of his opponent's concerns ensured that restoration remained impossible. The former king, who spent his final years in prayer and reflection, never fully understood why his subjects had rejected his rule. The legacy of James II in English historical memory has been shaped largely by Protestant historians who portrayed him as a tyrant whose overthrow was necessary for the preservation of English liberties. More recent scholarship has attempted to provide a more balanced assessment, recognising his genuine commitment to religious toleration while acknowledging the political disasters that his policies created. The family tragedy that James's reign represented was particularly poignant. His relationship with his daughters, Mary and Anne, was permanently damaged by the religious and political conflicts of his reign, while his son, James Francis Edward, would spend his entire life as a pretender to thrones he would never occupy. The dynasty that had ruled England for over a century was reduced to a shadow court in French exile. The lessons of James II's reign remain relevant for political leaders in any era. His story demonstrates the importance of understanding public opinion, the dangers of ideological extremism, and the necessity of adapting to changing circumstances. Most importantly, it shows how even well-intentioned policies can produce disastrous results when they ignore political realities and popular sentiment. As we conclude our peaceful exploration of this turbulent period in English history, we are reminded that historical figures were complex human beings facing difficult choices in challenging circumstances. James II was neither the saintly martyr that his supporters claimed, nor the tyrannical monster that his enemies described, but rather a sincere and capable man whose personal convictions proved incompatible with the responsibilities of kingship in Protestant England. The king who lost 3 kingdoms without a battle had nevertheless changed the course of British history in ways that neither he nor his contemporaries could have fully anticipated. His brief reign marked the end of absolute monarchy in England, and the beginning of the constitutional system that would eventually spread throughout the English-speaking world and beyond. And so we leave James II as history left him, in exile in France, separated from his kingdoms and his people, sustained by his faith but haunted by his failures. His story serves as both a cautionary tale about the dangers of political inflexibility and a reminder of the human costs of the great transformations that shape the destiny of nations. Sweet dreams, dear listeners, and may the gentle lessons of history carry you softly into peaceful slumber, perhaps dreaming of a time when kings and subjects, Catholics and Protestants, might have found ways to live together in harmony rather than driving each other into exile and revolution. The past cannot be changed, but its wisdom can still guide us toward a more understanding future. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the life of James II, the last Catholic king of England, the monarch who lost his throne in a bloodless revolution, and the man whose story reminds us that even the most powerful rulers are ultimately subject to the judgment of history and the will of their people.